Black trash. You dare say you'll heal me with leftovers? Sneered the millionaire woman, Eleanor Voss, her mocking laughter echoing through the lavish party, as the barefoot boy, M, raised his head in defiance. The whole squad of police officers roared, forcing him to his knees amid the scornful applause of the elite. At that exact moment, Eleanor's motionless toe twitched slightly, freezing the entire hall into silence. A single innocent statement had ignited a deeper truth. Justice, at times, begins with the weakest. Inside the white mansion at the heart of the city, golden light from the chandeliers spilled over the vast garden, turning it into a magnificent paradise, seemingly cut off from the outside world. Rows of long tables covered in white silk were neatly arranged, crystal glasses clinked softly, and the laughter of the elite echoed throughout the space. The rich aroma of fatty, luxurious food drifted through the air, blending with the sound of a live orchestra playing a familiar symphony, making the atmosphere feel even more powerful. Uniformed police officers stood in clusters around the entrance, their icy stares sweeping over everyone as if they held absolute authority over who was allowed to exist in this perfect picture. Just beyond the towering black iron gate, Malik stood pressed into the shadows. His bare, calloused feet were covered in road dust, his clothes torn and tattered, his scent a mix of sweat and exhaust fumes, making him a grotesque crack in the glowing scene. Malik's eyes locked onto the leftover dishes abandoned at the end of a table, where a distracted server hadn't yet cleared them away. Greasy red slices of meat, half-eaten pieces of cake, all gleamed under the lights, teasing his clenched, starving stomach. He hugged himself tightly, took a breath, but in those dark brown eyes was more than hunger, there was a flicker of resolve, a vague belief he couldn't explain. On the stage set up at the center of the garden, Eleanor Voss appeared. She was a white woman in her 40s, her face sharply defined, with cold blue eyes like ice. The gleaming red wheelchair she sat in gave off a metallic chill under the golden lights, heightening the respect and curiosity around her. Paralyzed after an accident years ago, Eleanor still carried herself with the aura of a millionaire, arrogant, indifferent, her head always held high against every whisper. She smiled faintly at the hollow praise from politicians and business people, seemingly relishing being the center of attention. No one dared to see the wheelchair as a flaw, because Eleanor always knew how to turn it into a symbol of power forged from tragedy. Malik stepped closer to the gate, quietly placing his small hand on the cold metal bars. He could clearly hear the clinking of glass, the loud laughter of a woman boasting about a recently closed $1 million deal. Malik looked up at the sparkling golden chandeliers overhead, a thought flashing through his mind. His world and theirs were separated by nothing but a gate, yet the distance felt like sky and earth. Hunger blurred his vision, but the image of those glowing leftover dishes stayed sharp, irresistible, impossible to ignore. A police officer slowly stepped forward, his boots striking the tiled ground with a sharp, echoing sound. His eyes swept across like a blade, and when they landed on the skinny black boy outside the gate, his lip curled in disdain. He jerked his chin, called over two fellow officers, then barked like thunder, "You little punk, a black kid like you dares show up here? Get lost, or I'll crush your bones." The sound sliced through the lively atmosphere. A few guests near the gate turned their heads, smirking slightly, as if they'd just been gifted a free show. Malik shivered, his arms hanging at his sides, but he didn't back down. His large, dark eyes burned with quiet defiance, his lips pressed tight as if swallowing the humiliation. The officers stood blocking the path, their shadows falling over him like iron clamps. From the stage, Eleanor glanced over and happened to catch the scene. Her smile faded, her eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly returned to her cold expression. A sudden silence swept over the party before the orchestra picked up again, pounding forward as if nothing had happened. But for Malik, that moment hung above him like a suspended verdict. He knew he had just provoked the wolves guarding the gates of the elite, the ones ready to crush anyone who dared step outside the pit that fate had dug for them. As Eleanor raised her glass of wine to her lips, her eyes never left the small boy beyond the gate. Something didn't fit in this picture, a misplaced piece that made the whole dazzling scene feel unsettlingly cracked. Malik still stood there, not kneeling, not running, not begging. It was that proud silence that made the air around him feel heavy as lead, as if the entire luxurious garden was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The night breeze passed through, carrying the scent of grilled meat and swirling wine, blending with the dust and sweat on Malik's skin. Under the glowing yellow lights, on one side sat Power in a red wheelchair, grinning with pride, and on the other stood a hungry boy staring straight at the leftover dishes. Two worlds collided in a single glance, but that distance alone was enough to spark the fuse of an unspoken war. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth curling into a faint, cold smile, while the officers gripped their batons tightly, and Malik, instead of stepping back, suddenly moved one step closer to the gate, his eyes wide, as if trying to absorb all the light into himself. In that fleeting instant, an invisible string stretched tight, linking the weakest with the most powerful figure in the garden. garden, ready to snap and ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. In the moment when the air felt compressed and the murmurs of the guests had just faded, Malik suddenly snapped his head up. The small boy, his clothes torn to shreds, his feet coated in dust, had eyes burning with a fierce light, as if he held a secret the world refused to believe. His thin hand gripped the iron bars, chest rising and falling, and then he said something no one there could have expected. "I'll heal you," his voice trembling but firm, echoing across the vast garden. "Just with leftovers." The words dropped into the party like a lightning bolt striking from the sky, tearing through the polished luxury. The crowd fell silent for a beat, then laughter burst out, first in scattered ripples, then swelling into a crashing wave. Wine glasses clanged together, guests leaned into each other, roaring with laughter, some slapping the tables in delight as if they had just heard the perfect joke. A bloated businessman choked from laughing too hard, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes, while a woman draped in fur shook her head and muttered, "Insane." A filthy kid daring to speak of healing a millionaire. Laughter rippled through the garden, colliding with the sudden halt of the orchestra, leaving behind a stifling chaos. Eleanor Voss sat in her red wheelchair under the spotlight, throwing her head back in loud laughter. Her laugh was sharp, piercing, drawn out as if to make clear just how absurd she found the moment. Her face flushed slightly, her shoulders trembling, and her icy blue eyes sparkled with ruthless amusement. When she finished, Eleanor leaned forward, resting one elbow on the side of her wheelchair, her voice cutting each word clearly. "A ragged little boy who's never even smelled proper medicine, healing me? In this entire city, even the best doctors have failed, and you dare say that to me?" Laughter erupted again, this time mixed with whistles and mocking applause. Malik still stood there, his hands trembling but his gaze steady. He didn't turn away or lower his head, but stared straight at the woman in the wheelchair, his eyes glowing with such fierce stubbornness that even a few of the people laughing paused for a second. But at that exact moment, a rough police hand grabbed him, shoving his head down onto the cold ground. A steel baton clanged against the iron bars, and the officer hissed through clenched teeth, "On your knees, punk, learn the rules here." In front of the elite, trash like you only belongs crawling on the ground. Malik was forced to his knees, his cheek slammed against the rough concrete just outside the gate, his mouth bleeding, but he bit his lip, eyes narrowing. No tears, no screams. The scene made the entire party erupt in gleeful applause. A group of guests stood up, laughing uncontrollably, clapping like they were watching a brilliant circus act. A man in a sleek black suit threw his head back and shouted, "That's right, show him his place." A woman nearby nodded, her voice dripping with mockery. "Trash like that was born for our entertainment, fits the setting perfectly." Amid the noise and ridicule, Eleanor sat still, her hand tightening slightly on the side of her wheelchair. The smile remained on her lips, but something flickered in her eyes, something hard to define. A vague feeling, as if the boy's words had struck a wound that had never fully healed. Eleanor blinked quickly to mask a brief flash of unease, then turned her face away as if that flicker had never happened. But in that fleeting moment, just long enough, a few nearby guests noticed the change in her gaze. Malik's head was still pinned to the ground, but he clenched his teeth, his voice choked yet firm. "Your money won't heal you, but faith might." The words escaped, quiet but clear enough to reach those standing close, making a few freeze before laughing even louder. The officer pushed his head down harder, snarling, "Shut your mouth, you think trash like you gets to talk here?" The guests' laughter grew even louder, like a vicious storm crashing through, swallowing the weakness of a child whole. Eleanor turned back, her blue eyes filled with scorn, yet deep within them, flicker of confusion hadn't entirely faded. She narrowed her gaze, studying the boy's face smeared with dirt and blood, the way he lifted his head in desperation without surrendering. Suddenly, in her mind, her own mocking laugh echoed back, tangled with the boy's trembling voice, forming a strange dissonance that made her heart falter. She cleared her throat quietly, gestured for the police to stop, then said coldly, "Enough. Get him out of here." The police let go, shoving Malik away from the gate like discarding something worthless. He stumbled hard onto the ground, his hands scraped and raw, yet he still lifted his face, eyes locked on Eleanor without blinking. That gaze wasn't pleading, it was a challenge. Amid the lingering waves of laughter across the garden, the moment their eyes met carved out a strange silence. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat, something that hadn't happened in years since the wheelchair had imprisoned her. The party resumed as if nothing had interrupted it, wine glasses raised again, the music swelling back into rhythm. But deep within that lavish night, the words, "I'll heal you, just with leftovers," had cracked something irreparable in the world Eleanor once believed was solid as steel. As for Malik, he tasted the salty blood on his lips, but the fire in his chest only flared hotter. He had no way of knowing that his small act of defiance had shaken an entire gathering of power and sparked a chain of events no one could have foreseen. Before the commotion had time to settle, Eleanor Voss leaned slightly back, her slender hand resting on the arm of her wheelchair, her blue eyes slicing through what had just occurred like a blade. She didn't yell, didn't show anger, her voice dropped low, yet cold enough to freeze the air. "Keep him outside the gate," Eleanor said clearly, each word cutting through the crowd's laughter. "I don't need trash." A hush fell, then applause followed, along with a few whistles of approval. Her words came down like a hammer on the boy's fate, turning him into a punchline that the entire opulent garden could continue enjoying. A police officer standing beside Malik, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement, slowly leaned in close to his face. He grabbed the boy by the collar, lifted him slightly, and growled with a rasping laugh. "You hear that, kid? You think faith is some kind of magic cure? How much is your faith worth to heal her? A penny? A leftover chicken bone?" He let out a dry chuckle, his breath reeking of alcohol brushing against Malik's skin, while his free hand tapped a baton rhythmically against the bars like mocking percussion. Malik clenched his jaw, his eyes red and swollen from being pinned to the ground, yet still glowing with defiance. His voice came out hoarse but firm, causing the people nearby to pause for a split second. "Your money won't heal her." The words cut through the noise, not loud, but clear enough for anyone nearby to catch the raw, unshakable pride in them. It struck like a curse cast from the weak, a blade driven straight into the pride of those who lived in luxury. The police around him widened their eyes for a moment, then burst into laughter, as if they had just witnessed a rare performance. One slapped a fellow officer on the back and shouted, "Did you hear that?" He insulted a millionaire, a black kid in rags, talking straight to Mrs. Voss. This beats the live music. The laughter rolled on, rippling and echoing through the garden like crashing waves. Guests started whispering. Some doubled over the table laughing, others raising their wine glasses while pointing at Malik, spitting venom. Exactly the entertainment tonight was missing. This kid's worth more than the whole orchestra. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, the smile tugging at her lips now different, no longer amused. It held a new edge, harder to read, as if even she had been shaken by his words. She stared at Malik longer, her cold blue eyes studying every detail of the bloodied face in front of her. She could hear those words echo inside her head. "Your money won't heal her." And for a brief moment, all the laughter seemed to vanish, leaving only that searing phrase lodged deep in her mind. Eleanor tightened her grip on the armrest of the wheelchair, masking her unease by lifting her wine glass and drinking it down as if trying to swallow the unsettling tremor that had just sparked inside her. Malik staggered, blood still trickling from his mouth, but he stood up straight, his eyes never lowering. A few guests were surprised, expecting the boy to cry or beg, but instead, the stubbornness in his gaze made people uncomfortable. An older man with silver hair muttered bitterly, "Maybe he wants to be beaten to death before he shuts up." Another chimed in, "Or if Mrs. Voss allows, we could teach him a lesson, keep him from ever insulting the wealthy again." Laughter exploded again, louder, crueler, like a chorus of arrogance swelling in unison. Chief of Police Drake, who had silently observed the party from the beginning, finally stepped forward. He was tall, his uniform perfectly pressed, face lined with rigid creases, eyes sharp as blades. Drake stopped in front of Malik, leaned down, his voice echoing low and heavy with contempt. "A piece of trash like you dares speak like that? Do you even know where you are? This is the world of people you'll never touch. Here, we have rules, and our rules say that someone like you belongs crawling on the ground." He turned to the guests with a faint smile, as if offering them the next act in the evening's entertainment. Malik trembled from exhaustion and fear but still managed to say, "Your rules can't touch the truth." His voice, though quiet, was firm, like a small stone thrown against the towering wall of pride surrounding him. Drake smirked and gestured, and two officers immediately lifted Malik by the arms, hoisting him like a sack. The crowd cheered. Some even whistled in support. A young woman exclaimed mockingly, "He dared to talk back to the chief? That's insane, but I love it. A little blood might make this more fun." Amid the noise, Eleanor kept watching in silence. In her mind, the image of the boy being dragged outside overlapped with a memory from years ago, when another man had once collapsed under police batons, blood spreading wide, leaving a wound in her heart that never healed. She shook her head slightly, telling herself this was just a nameless child, a scrap of nothing unworthy of concern. But when Malik lifted his head, his eyes cutting through the crowd to find her, that defiant stare pierced straight into the place Eleanor had tried hardest to bury. Drake raised his hand to give the order, and Malik was forced back down to the ground again, his knees slamming against the concrete with a loud thud that sent the crowd into roaring laughter. Another officer stepped up, tapping his baton on Malik's shoulder, voice thick with mockery. "This is your place, kid. Kneel down and learn to stay quiet, because here, someone like you is just a nameless shadow." Malik growled, struggling to lift his head, his voice hoarse but steady. "If she wants to walk, she has to dare to believe, and that belief your money can't buy it." This time, the crowd fell silent for a brief beat, not because they believed him, but because the boldness of his words caught them off guard. Then, laughter erupted again, louder, crashing like a storm. A middle-aged man clapped loudly, shouting, "Did you hear that? He's lecturing Mrs. Voss. What a night to remember." The mocking laughter swallowed everything, the music, the scent of wine and flowers, turning the garden into a harsh arena where a child had become the night's entertainment. Eleanor raised her glass, eyes still fixed on Malik. She smiled, but the smile didn't last. It faded quietly, as she realized she was being drawn into a strange dialogue with the boy. Every word he spoke felt like a hammer blow against the wall of pride she had built over the years. Outwardly, she remained the cold, composed millionaire woman, but deep inside, a crack had started to form. The party carried on, but from that moment, no one knew a barefoot boy had just planted the first seed, a seed of resistance against a power once thought unshakable. And even Eleanor Voss, the woman who believed herself untouchable, had begun to feel that power not as protection, but as a force slowly dragging her under. The night's party ended with pounding music and the sting of alcohol lingering in crystal glasses, but beyond the gate, the image of a barefoot child dragged across the cold tile remained like a bloodstain that could not be washed away. Malik stumbled away from the white mansion, his scraped feet pressing against the pavement like stepping on blades. He walked through the darkness, the night wind slicing into his wounds, his stomach twisting with hunger. The pain clawed at him like hundreds of ants crawling backward through his gut, making his head spin, but he didn't stop. The golden lights from the lavish party still glowed behind him, bright as a world he had just stormed into, crushed by, and been thrown out of. He knew he didn't belong there, but he also refused to accept a fate that cast him as an invisible shadow in the city. The road led back to the slum narrow, damp, and endlessly bleak. The houses leaned like they might collapse, tin roofs full of holes, walls stained with mildew. Malik dragged himself forward, his calloused feet leaving smeared trails of blood across the filthy ground. The stench of garbage and sewage mixed with the bitter smoke of cheap cigarettes from drifters loitering in the alley. It was a world that felt like a black hole, the exact opposite of the shining scene he had just escaped. But this was home, the place where Malik had grown up through nights of hunger, through screaming matches, and through the sirens wailing endlessly in the streets. In the dark, the image of his father returned with painful clarity. Malik remembered that rainy afternoon, when the thin man he called father was dragged out into the marketplace by police, accused of stealing just because he held a loaf of bread. Even though his father shouted that he had paid, no one listened. Batons rained down, the sound of blows pounding into flesh, groans fading into silence. Malik was only 8 at the time, and he had rushed forward to grab his father's sleeve, only to be shoved hard to the ground by a cop. He saw his father's eyes go dim, blood pooling everywhere, and then his body went still. There was no apology, no explanation, only a report that said, "Death caused by resisting law enforcement." Oh, that memory cut into Malik's heart like a blade, leaving behind a fear and fury that never faded. He had once cried himself hoarse, had stayed up countless nights asking why a life could be taken away over a groundless accusation, and the only answers from those around him were dry, dismissive laughs. That's the fate of poor black folks around here. No one cares. Malik grew up in that brutal truth, but instead of bowing his head, a slow-burning fire took root inside him. That night, as his head was forced down in front of the mansion gate, as the mocking laughter of the elite rang in his ears, Malik suddenly saw his father collapse all over again. He remembered those helpless eyes, the blood soaking into the concrete, the feeling of his small hands unable to hold on. Malik clenched his fists, fingernails digging so deep into his skin they drew blood. Silently, through every ounce of pain he had endured, he swore that no one else would be forced to kneel before them again. In the rundown room deep in the slum, Malik lay down on a torn old mattress, moonlight slipping through a small crack in the wall, casting pale light across his bruised face. Hunger hadn't released him, but his mind was flooded with images and words. "I'll heal you, just with and leftovers." Malik whispered the words again, remembering the moment Eleanor burst into laughter, the police hand pressing his head down. He'd been mocked, beaten, but he felt no regret. Instead, that line had shown him the one power he still possessed: belief. Belief wouldn't bring his father back, wouldn't fill an empty stomach, but it was the only thing that allowed Malik to stand upright in a world always trying to push him down. That belief, he wanted to give it to Eleanor, the woman in the red wheelchair. He didn't know how, didn't know what it would take, but one thought rang clearly in his chest. If he could make her believe in a single step, that step could be the beginning of everything. Malik closed his eyes, hearing the rain begin to tap against the rusted tin roof, mixing with the sound of his own shallow breathing. Outside, the city burned in neon and sirens, a world where kids like him never had a place. But he believed that one day, With his calloused feet and unshaken heart, he would walk out of this darkness. And when that day came, the small flame he carried inside wouldn't just light his path. It would burn bright enough to guide others who had been crushed beneath the same weight. Malik knew he had nothing but his resolve. No weapons, no money, no one to lean on, only the memory of his father, the sting of humiliation, and a belief that never dimmed. He rested his head on his thin arm, eyes wide open, staring at the rotting ceiling, whispering into the night like a promise, "I won't back down. I'll make them see even a poor kid can change his fate." That night, in a crumbling slum home, a flame was lit in the heart of a 12-year-old boy. It was small but relentless, able to be buried in filth, trampled by power, but never extinguished. And from that spark, an uneven battle waited to ignite, ready to become a blaze that would tear down walls once thought untouchable. After the party, laughter still lingered faintly in the air like a stain. Eleanor Voss sat silently in her red wheelchair, its wheels rolling slowly along the polished stone path leading back into the mansion. Staff bowed as she passed, but their eyes avoided her frozen face. The heavy front doors shut behind her, sealing in a vast, luxurious space that felt cold despite its beauty. The walls were lined with paintings, chandeliers glittered overhead, and everything was perfectly arranged yet lifeless. Eleanor stopped in front of the massive mirror hanging in the grand hall and stared down at her motionless legs. Her body trembled for a moment before she turned away quickly, but the sound still echoed. "Your money won't heal her." The boy's hoarse voice rang again in her mind, sharp and raw like a scratch that refused to fade. She shook her head hard, but another image crept in, the stubborn, defiant smile on Malik's face, even as his head was pinned to the ground. It unsettled her, like a splinter embedded deep beneath the skin, not enough to wound, but impossible to ignore. Night fell, and the mansion fell quiet. Eleanor sat alone in the study, neon light from the city still glowing beyond the glass. Her wineglass was half empty, but the bitterness in her throat couldn't smother the unease inside. The sound of her wheelchair gliding across the polished wood floor scraped softly as her pulse thudded unevenly. The words from the party clung to her, refusing to let go, pulling at the pride she had always worn like armor. The study door opened. The tall frame of Chief Drake filled the doorway. He still wore his crisply pressed uniform, every movement radiating the confidence of a man who held power. He didn't greet her, didn't ask permission. He walked in, as if this place, too, was under his control. Eleanor raised her head, her icy eyes locking on him, but she didn't tell him to leave. Drake stood in front of her desk, hands clasped behind his back, voice thick and slow like a decree. "Mrs. Voss, that kid is dangerous. A child who dares to challenge power in the middle of your party, who has the nerve to look you in the eye and insult all of us. He won't stop. Just say the word, and I'll take care of it. No trace, no fallout." Eleanor said nothing, turning the wine glass slowly in her hand, listening to the echo of every word. The word dangerous rang in her ears, making her frown. Malik, a barefoot child, clothes in rags, so hungry he could only look at leftovers. How could he be called dangerous? She looked up, the cold fire in her blue eyes sharp as glass, and spoke clearly. "What's there to fear in a filthy little boy?" The blunt reply made Drake's lip curl into a faint smirk. He stepped closer, his voice lower but sharper. "It's the filthy, overlooked things that become the easiest sparks to ignite everything. You know well, even a small flame can bring down an entire forest." If he dared to say what he said in front of the entire elite tonight, tomorrow, when he could have hundreds listening. "Belief, madam, is sometimes more dangerous than any weapon." Drake lowered his tone to a whisper. "It's best to extinguish it while it's still weak." Eleanor braced herself on the desk, her eyes flashing with irritation. She didn't like being threatened, and she hated being lectured even more. "That's your job, not mine," she replied flatly, then turned her wheelchair away from Drake. But her heart was pounding, because deep down, she knew he wasn't entirely wrong. That boy had shaken the entire party with just one sentence. Drake watched her retreating figure, his eyes darkening, but he gave a small nod, as if he had expected that reaction. Before leaving, he left her with a final remark. "I won't let that spark turn into a blaze. Remember this, Mrs. Voss, our power exists because of the silence of the weak. The moment a child dares to speak, that silence starts to break." The door closed, and the room fell into stillness. Eleanor sat alone, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Her hand rested on her legs, and that familiar wave of helplessness returned. Her lifeless legs felt like a sentence she had carried for years. But when she closed her eyes, something else crept in, a faint, childlike laugh, echoing from somewhere distant. She jolted, eyes snapping open, but the room was empty. That night, Eleanor drifted into sleep from exhaustion, and the dream came like a storm. In it, she stood on a wide field of grass, the wind whipping past, her hair flying, and her legs unbound. She walked, step by steady step, the breeze brushing between her toes, sending shivers down her spine. Laughter echoed in her ears, familiar, childlike, bright, innocent. It wasn't the laughter of anyone from the party. It was the same laugh she had just heard from the barefoot boy. Malik appeared in the dream, not far from her, his eyes glowing like fire, his smile radiant. He didn't speak, just looked at her, and that smile seemed to push her forward, calling her out of the dark and into the light. She jolted awake in the middle of the night, sweat damp on her forehead, breath unsteady. Silver moonlight streamed through the window, casting a long shadow of the red wheelchair across the floor like a set of shackles. Eleanor shakily reached down to touch her legs, the cold sensation making her clench her fists. The images from the dream were too real, too vivid to dismiss. That childish laugh still echoed in her head, a strange sound that left her unsettled. In the heavy darkness of the mansion, Eleanor sat motionless. Power was still in her hands. Money still filled her vaults, but never had she felt this out of control. A barefoot, poor boy had planted something inside her, a seed of unrest. And Eleanor Voss, the woman long believed untouchable, for the first time in years, felt something slipping beyond the grasp of the power that had once kept her afloat. The next morning, as the first sunlight struck the warped tin roofs of the slum, Malik dragged his cracked, aching feet to the back kitchen of a luxury hotel, where staff were rushing to clear out leftovers from the previous night's party. The smell of grilled meat, garlic butter bread, and traces of expensive wine left in glass bottles made his stomach twist with hunger. He stood still for a moment, his thin hand clutching the hem of his shirt, then slowly stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "Sir, may I have some leftovers?" The chef, already irritated by a pile of dirty dishes, turned and glared at Malik from head to toe, his eyes filled with disgust, as if the boy in front of him wasn't a person but some parasitic animal. He didn't reply, just grabbed a full plate of leftover food and flung it hard to the ground in front of Malik. Food splattered across the floor, pieces of cake, scraps of meat landing in the dirt as the sound of breaking china drew giggles from nearby staff. The chef crossed his arms and sneered, "There, that's your place. Pick it up and eat it." Just then, the sound of boots echoed from the back door. A police officer stationed outside had wandered in, curious, and spotted Malik on his knees, gathering crumbs of food from the dusty ground. He let out a hoarse, bitter laugh and muttered something bone-chilling. "That's right, pick it up, little mutt." He put extra weight on the last two words, voice dripping with mockery, setting off another round of loud laughter from those nearby. Malik looked up, his eyes meeting the officer's twisted smile, then slowly looked down again, his hands trembling as he collected pieces of bread and meat speckled with dirt. At that moment, Eleanor Voss happened to pass by the upstairs hallway. She had just left a private meeting and was heading back to her room when she caught sight of the scene through the large glass window overlooking the kitchen. At first, she glanced out of habit, but when she recognized the small face, she stopped. Her blue eyes focused downward, seeing Malik on his knees, gathering filthy food with his hands, seeing the officer standing there, arms folded, laughing, seeing the staff treating him like a cheap joke. Something jolted in her chest, a strange ache settling deep as she froze in place. That image mirrored too closely the memory of her husband years ago, also on his knees under police batons, blood flooding the floor, and she had stood there, unable to stop it. Eleanor's hand unconsciously tightened around the armrest of her wheelchair, her chest constricting, the corner of her mouth twitching, as if to issue a command, but then she fell silent. Her power could have stopped that officer, could have protected the boy for a moment, so why didn't she? She hated the feeling of her heart stirring for a child she had once called trash. Eleanor turned away, trying to swallow the guilt, but Malik's eyes, lifting at that very moment, struck her like a blade to the chest. Malik slowly gathered the scattered food into an old plastic container, crumbs of dry bread mixed with dust, but he didn't cry. He clutched the box to his chest like a treasure, then stood tall. Under the sneering gaze of the officer and soft giggles from nearby, Malik suddenly raised his head, eyes glowing as he looked toward Eleanor standing far off behind the glass. A weary yet resolute smile formed on his bruised face, and he said loudly, clearly, "Tomorrow, you will take a step." The space fell still. The officer frowned, scoffing, "This kid's lost his mind." The chef snorted, threw his towel on the counter, and muttered, "You should know your place." But Eleanor, still seated in her wheelchair, felt those words strike her square in the chest. One step, just one step, those words echoed like a declaration. Naive, bold, and somehow dangerous. She didn't know why her heart was trembling, as if that boy had thrown a spark straight into the frozen core of her being. Malik hugged the filthy food container tightly as he limped out of the kitchen, drops of blood from his feet trailing across the cold tiles. He didn't look back, didn't answer a single taunt, just held on to that smile, a smile that made even those who had been laughing hesitate for a second. Eleanor watched him until his figure disappeared, her eyes flickering with conflict. She told herself it was nothing, that she didn't care, but inside, that innocent promise had taken root, and it refused to let go. That night, as Eleanor returned to her room and sat by the window overlooking the city, Malik's words echoed clearly in her mind. Tomorrow, you will take a step. She reached down to touch her lifeless legs, feeling the familiar cold. For years, hundreds of doctors, countless therapies, and millions of dollars had gone into trying, but all of it had been hopeless. And now, a hungry boy living off scraps had dared to promise the impossible. Eleanor let out a dry laugh, but the pounding in her chest betrayed her. One part of her refused to believe, but another trembled with fragile hope. In the grand mansion, darkness fell, while out there, deep in the dusty slums, Malik sat in his small room, placing the food container on the table. He ate every crumb, dirt and all, whispering between bites, "Tomorrow, you will have to walk, because I already believe." That belief, held in the hands of a poor child, became his only weapon, shining brighter than any sword, and that very belief, like a flickering flame, was beginning to reach the heart long locked away in the ice of Eleanor Voss. The next morning, while Malik sat on a rickety wooden chair in his cramped room, headlines had already flooded the digital news sites. Sensational titles flashed across screens. Black boy promises to heal paralyzed millionaire using leftovers. Beneath them, a storm of laughing emojis and mocking comments poured in. People shared a clip from the party, the moment Malik lifted his head and made the statement before being forced down onto the cement. The video had been edited, exaggerated, and turned into the morning's entertainment for millions. Someone captioned it, "New superhero unlocked, heals with crumbs." Society laughed, and the shame spread faster than the wind. By midday, the entertainment segment on television devoted a full 5 minutes to this performance. The screen showed Malik kneeling, his head pressed to the ground, golden party lights casting a bitter contrast. The anchor smirked. "A wandering boy claims he can heal the city's most famous millionaire. Viewers, should we call it a joke or a tragedy?" A commentator added, "In my opinion, it's nothing but cheap theater, a hungry kid trying to get attention, and maybe he succeeded. But succeeded in turning himself into a national joke." The studio erupted in laughter, and that laughter echoed across living rooms, cafes, and anywhere people consumed low-cost entertainment to kill time. Malik saw his own image on the old television hanging in the corner eatery at the end of the alley. He stood still, clutching his dirty food box, his chest tightening as if his heart were being squeezed. People in the shop laughed along, some glancing over and muttering, "Hey, isn't that the kid from the clip? Looks just like the boy from this slum." Another scoffed, "That boy probably thinks he's some kind of prophet. Kids these days are ridiculous." Malik lowered his head, said nothing, but inside, the fire flared. He wasn't angry about the mockery, he was angry at how easily people believed the contempt that the media had fed them. Meanwhile, at Central Police Headquarters, Drake sat in his office, legs propped on the desk, a lit cigar glowing as smoke curled thick around him. In front of him was a large screen replaying the same clip, the sound of laughter looping over and over. Drake tapped his fingers on the desk, his hardened face stretching into a satisfied grin. He blew smoke toward the ceiling and chuckled, "Good, very good. The public loves this circus. Let the boy destroy himself. We won't have to lift a finger, he'll drown in their laughter." An officer beside him added, "People love mocking the weak. The more he resists, the more they laugh. It's perfect entertainment for the city." Drake nodded, lips curling. "Let him be the joke, and drag Mrs. Voss in with him. Then everyone will understand. Challenge us, and humiliation is all you get." Inside the White Mansion, Eleanor Voss was also watching the news. She sat motionless in her wheelchair, facing the flat-screen TV mounted in the living room. The same images repeated endlessly, the barefoot boy kneeling, his head forced down, yet his eyes still burning bright. The commentators called it cheap theater, and the studio audience burst into laughter. Eleanor heard every word, and for the first time, her chest tightened not out of pity for the boy, but because she felt like she, too, was being mocked. In the clip, they weren't just laughing at Malik, they were laughing at her, the woman in the red wheelchair, being promised healing by a poor black child. They laughed at her weakness, her paralyzed legs, and the pride she had worn like armor for so long. Eleanor turned off the TV, but the sound kept ringing in her head. She remembered the way Malik had looked at her through the glass, the way he said, "Tomorrow, you will take a step." Her hand trembled, wanting to shake it all off, but unable to. Suddenly, she felt pulled into the same spiral of ridicule as the boy. She, Eleanor Voss, the woman admired by the world, had now become part of a national punchline. Never before had her power felt so fragile. Outside, the mockery didn't stop. Social media overflowed with edited images. Malik wearing a crown, holding breadcrumbs, standing before Eleanor like some kind of miracle healer. Someone wrote, "Pay the boy, at least give him a slice of cake." Others scoffed, "If belief could cure illness, doctors would all be out of a job." The laughter of the crowd became a blade, tearing apart both the pride of the child and the dignity of the powerful woman. Malik returned to his dark room, clutching the dirty food container. Outside, a loudspeaker echoed faintly, spreading news about him like wildfire. He didn't collapse, but his eyes slowly reddened. In his mind, his father's image reappeared: bloodshot eyes, the sound of batons striking, and the cruel laughter of the police that day. Malik whispered into the darkness, "If the whole world laughs, then I'll rise to show them. One day, this laughter will be swallowed back." Eleanor, sitting alone in her study, whispered something almost identical. Her heart beat faster, not from anger at Malik, but because she knew too well the humiliation of being turned into a public joke. And for the first time, she asked herself, was that boy really as dangerous as Drake claimed? Or were the ones laughing the true threat to her power? Across the city, the laughter echoed like a storm, but in the midst of it, two people who seemed worlds apart, a poor child and a millionaire woman, were feeling the same thing, the shame of being reduced to a joke. And it was that unexpected thread of shared humiliation that quietly tied them together, setting the stage for a shift, where society's laughter would no longer mark the end, but spark a rebellion waiting to explode. Night fell over Eleanor Voss's white mansion, the golden lights lining the walkway, casting a soft glow on each marble step. The towering iron gate stood like a fortress wall, dividing the world of power from the world of shadows. Malik stood there, his bare feet on the cold stone, clutching an empty plastic food container, eyes fixed on the black steel bars. For 3 days straight, he had been turned into a laughingstock across the media. But the more they laughed, the brighter the determination burned in his gaze. Tonight, Malik had snuck back here, not to beg for food, but to beg for one chance, a chance to prove himself. His footsteps echoed across the quiet courtyard. The moon hung high, casting a silver light over his thin shoulders, making him look like a small shadow facing a towering castle. He pressed close to the gate and spoke, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Please, give me a chance. I want to prove what I said, just once." His words weren't loud enough to rise above the wind, but they made the two guards turn their heads. They instantly recognized the face, the same one mocked across the city for days. One of them hissed, voice full of contempt, "You again, you little piece of trash. Haven't had enough? The whole city's laughing at you, and you still crawl back here?" He stepped forward, baton in hand, and swung without warning. Malik couldn't dodge. A loud crack echoed as the blow landed, dropping him to the ground, blood spilling from his mouth onto his shirt. Still, his eyes stayed up, steady. "I just want to prove it," Malik whispered. But before the words could fade, another blow came harder, heavier. His small frame trembled, hands crushing the empty box in his grip. The second officer laughed, leaned down, and slammed Malik's head against the stone. His voice came sharp and cruel. "You're lucky you're still breathing, trash. You were born garbage. Prove something? Prove how many hits you can take before you stop moving." He struck again and again, each hit echoing into the night, blending with Malik's ragged breathing. The boy curled up, never begging, blood spilling in dark streaks across the polished floor. Meanwhile, high above, Eleanor sat by the window, one hand resting on her chin, eyes gazing into the quiet garden. She had drunk half a glass of wine, but her mind was restless, haunted by Malik's laughter, his words, and that strange dream. When she glanced down through the glass, a small figure by the gate caught her eye. Eleanor frowned, instantly recognizing the boy. And seconds later, she saw the scene that made her chest tighten, Malik being beaten relentlessly, blood spraying from his mouth, his body shaking, yet his eyes still locked on the gate, pleading for the chance to be heard. Eleanor gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her body trembling, then suddenly rose with a scream that echoed through the entire house. "Stop! Let him go!" The sound tore through the silence, startling the officers. Malik lifted his head, his blurred vision still lit with clarity at the sound of that voice. The household staff rushed out in panic, never having seen Eleanor lose control like this. The gate creaked open, and from the shadows emerged the figure of Chief Drake. He walked forward slowly, his face emotionless, eyes burning with contempt. He raised a hand, and the two officers stepped back. Drake leaned down to look at Malik, then raised his head to face Eleanor, who sat frozen in her wheelchair at the entrance. His voice rang deep and steady, each word slicing into her pride like a knife. "Ma'am, even you are just a puppet in a wheelchair. Don't think your screaming can change the law around here." His words echoed across the courtyard, leaving everyone stunned. Eleanor froze, hands trembling, her face pale. Never in her life had anyone dared speak to her like that, to humiliate her openly in front of her staff and the police. Drake didn't flinch. He knew full well those words struck like a slap across Eleanor's proud face. She saw Malik's blood drip onto the ground beneath her, saw the look in his eyes, as if to say that pain was less terrifying than silence. Eleanor clenched her hands, her chest tightening, heat rising within her. In that moment, she no longer heard the laughter, no longer saw the lights, but felt only one thing: that she had been dismissed, humiliated, treated just like Malik, voiceless, invisible. And Eleanor Voss knew, If she stayed silent, she would become a shadow in her own world. Malik sat up with the last of his strength, blood streaking his face, but his eyes still blazed. Eleanor looked at him, then turned to Drake. Her voice was hoarse but rang out, stripped of its usual coldness. "I said stop, don't make me say it again." In that moment, Eleanor's power and pride surged back, shattering the frozen walls she had built around herself. Malik gave a weak smile, blood still at his lips, but the smile carried a strange understanding. In that instant, the two of them, a millionaire in a wheelchair and a barefoot child, shared one truth. Power can crush, but it can also be challenged by faith and the pride of those who refuse to bow. The courtyard, having just weathered a storm of fury, suddenly fell into silence. Eleanor could still hear the pounding of her own heart as she looked at Malik's bloodied face, his eyes still blazing. The sting of Drake's insult had barely faded when it was replaced by an impulsive decision, as if some force within her pushed forward. She gripped the armrest and said, her voice cold but commanding, "Bring the boy in. If you claim to heal, prove it." Her words made everyone freeze, for no one had ever seen Eleanor allow such a challenge in front of so many people. The two officers hesitated, but Eleanor's gaze allowed no refusal. Malik was helped inside, each step leaving a trail of blood across the polished stone floor. The staff whispered among themselves, confusion and curiosity mixed in their eyes, while Drake stood off to the side, arms crossed, lips curled in mockery. Eleanor sat still in the vast living room, her icy gaze following the boy's staggering steps. Though she had spoken the words, even she didn't believe in what was about to happen. A poor child, uneducated, with no tools, what could he possibly do to heal legs the world's finest doctors had failed to treat? Malik was placed on the carpet, facing Eleanor. The room thickened with tension, only broken by the boy's heavy breathing. Eleanor didn't look away, her voice sliced through the stillness. "Speak. What are you going to do? Don't think some foolish remark can shake me." Malik raised his head, eyes locking onto hers. Unafraid, he slowly lifted his blood-stained hand and gently placed it on her lifeless legs. His small hand trembled, but his gaze remained steady. "I have no medicine," Malik said slowly, his voice hoarse but clear. "I only have faith." In that moment, the entire room fell still. Eleanor frowned, smirked in disbelief, but the laugh never lasted. The fragile hand on her cold legs dragged her back to the long, desperate nights in the hospital, to the doctors declaring hope was gone. Everything money could buy had been bought, and the result was still paralysis. And now, a boy covered in wounds, blood still seeping from his mouth, dared to say that faith could do what wealth could not. Eleanor wanted to laugh, loud enough to crush such arrogance, but her throat tightened. Silence was all that came. Malik closed his eyes, tightened his grip, and spoke again, louder. "You have to believe you'll walk, not because of me, not because of anyone, just because you dare to believe." His words rang like a bell through the mansion, leaving everyone stunned. From the back, Drake scoffed, his tone biting. "This kid really knows how to put on a show. Faith? What has faith ever done but lead people to their graves?" But Eleanor didn't turn to respond. She kept her eyes on Malik, as if held there by the fire in his. A turmoil rose within Eleanor. She had once believed in power, in money, in renowned doctors, but all of them had betrayed her. For the first time, a 12-year-old child told her that all she needed was to believe. She wondered, if her legs were truly beyond saving, would it be worth the risk to believe just once? Malik opened his eyes, staring straight at her, his gaze blazing despite everything. His small hand still rested on her legs, trembling but persistent, a silent challenge that she would either believe or remain, forever seated in that proud but powerless red wheelchair. The room sank into stillness, the warm light casting the two figures clearly, one a millionaire in a wheelchair, the other a bloodied poor boy. The gap of class, power, and prejudice compressed into this single moment. And Eleanor Voss, the woman who once believed herself untouchable, suddenly felt her chest tighten at two simple words: faith. Drake stepped back a few paces, his eyes cold as steel, then suddenly burst out laughing. His voice echoed through the grand room, sharp as a blade slashing into the taut silence. He slapped the armrest of his chair, his words hissing through clenched teeth with contempt. "You'd be smarter to believe in a dog, a filthy little brat from the slums teaching you about faith? This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen." His laughter dragged on, deliberately taunting, making even the nearby staff flinch and hold their breath. Malik remained still, his face bruised, hand resting on her motionless legs, gaze unflinching. He didn't respond, letting the venomous words rain down like hammer strikes, because he knew any reaction would only fuel more mockery. But in that silence, his eyes burned brighter, with a determination so intense it caught Eleanor off guard. Eleanor sat upright in her red wheelchair, her posture rigid, but her hands on the armrests trembled slightly. She felt a mix of anger and unease, angry at being made a spectacle in her own home, uneasy because the boy's gaze was unlike anything she'd known. It wasn't resentful, It wasn't pleading, but like a fire daring her, exposing corners of her soul she had kept hidden. Drake kept talking, his tone mocking. Mrs. Voss, come to your senses. Don't let a child's words shake you. If you believe him, you'll be nothing but a joke in front of the world. His words repeated, cornering Eleanor into a choice. But this time, she didn't respond the way she used to. She turned to look at Malik, saw his bloodied young face, his eyes still lifted, and in that moment, she felt herself surrender to something she couldn't explain. A heavy silence stretched on, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the room. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hand gripping the armrest tightly, then turned to Drake. Her voice was hoarse, no longer as firm as usual, but still resolute. Enough, I want him to stay tonight. The words dropped like a detonation, shaking the air. Drake's eyes widened, the corner of his mouth twitching in disbelief. Then he glared at her. You're playing with fire. Let him stay one night, and tomorrow the whole city will laugh in your face. Eleanor didn't answer, her eyes locked on Malik, half angry, half trembling, as if she were fighting herself. The servants quietly nodded, quickly escorting Malik to a small guest room at the end of the hallway. His figure faded into the distance, leaving Eleanor with a strange mix of relief and unease. Drake shook his head, let out a dry chuckle, and walked away. But just before leaving the room, he tossed back a warning. Don't let a child drag you down from your throne. Eleanor remained alone in the dark, her mind a tangle. She didn't know why she had made that decision, didn't know whether it was weakness or the first step towards something bigger. But deep down, she knew it was that faint smile and those defiant eyes that had planted a seed she couldn't uproot. Night wore on, rain beginning to fall softly outside the window, blending with the sound of wind whistling through the trees. Eleanor stayed still, eyes closed, the image of Malik's gaze, his small hand resting on her legs, playing over and over like a refrain. She wouldn't admit it to anyone, but in the deepest corner of her solitude, Eleanor had begun to waver. And that hesitation, however slight, was enough to shake the proud wall she had spent years building. 1 week later, while the public still buzzed with mockery, Eleanor Voss unexpectedly hosted a new party in the Guard, glowing with lights. Rows of tables covered in pristine white cloth stretched out, glasses of red wine swirled in the guests' hands, and the soft notes of violins floated among lively chatter. People came not only to flatter the wealthy woman but also to see for themselves whether the rumor about her housing a street kid was true. The atmosphere was thick with curiosity, a mix of mockery and suspicion, all eyes fixed on the bright red wheelchair at the center. Eleanor appeared in a darker, simpler gown than usual, but her presence still silenced the entire garden for a brief moment. She didn't present any new deals or raise her glass for a toast, but simply nodded. The large doors opened, and Malik entered. He wore clothes slightly cleaner than usual, but his bare feet and faint bruises still betrayed his origin. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some hiding laughter behind their hands, others leaning in to whisper, "She's brought us a new circus act." Malik stood beside Eleanor, his eyes steady on the crowd, his thin shoulders unshaking. He said nothing, only waited in silence. Eleanor looked at him, then turned to the sea of expectant faces, her voice ringing clear. "Tonight, I want you to see for yourselves. If you believe this is just theater, let the truth speak for itself." The guests burst into laughter, a few clapping mockingly, treating it as the start of an amusing performance. From the crowd, Drake stepped forward, uniform crisp, face hard as stone. He looked Malik up and down with disdain, then smirked. "End this farce," he said, voice low but booming, "so I can throw him out myself." Laughter echoed again, many nodding in agreement, convinced that this poor boy could offer nothing but continued ridicule. Eleanor didn't respond, only motioned for silence. Malik drew a breath and took one step closer to the wheelchair. Jeers rose from the far end of the table, but his gaze didn't waver. He leaned down, his thin hand resting lightly on Eleanor's, and said in a voice soft but firm, "Now is the time you must believe." The air froze. Eleanor sat still, her hand trembling slightly, her sharp blue eyes suddenly flickering. In her mind echoed every taunt, every scornful glance, and the childish laughter from that dream. Malik looked up, eyes blazing, as if lighting a fire in her frozen heart. She didn't know why she nodded, but in that moment, Eleanor slowly relaxed her legs. Malik shifted slightly to the side, his hand still resting on her knee, his voice rising once more. "Just one small movement. You have to believe you can." Eleanor closed her eyes, blocking out the laughter, the skeptical stares, and focused on her feet, motionless for so many years. A strange current ran down her spine, spreading to her toes. And then, under the golden glow of the party lights, her toe twitched. The entire garden fell silent. The violin stopped. Wineglasses froze mid-air. Every eye turned toward the red wheelchair, where a once lifeless leg had just trembled. Malik stood upright, withdrew his hand, and smiled calmly, while Eleanor opened her eyes, her lips trembling, even she unable to believe what had just happened. Drake frowned, took a step forward, but murmurs had already begun rippling through the guests, gasps echoing all around. Some shouted, others stammered, speechless. Eleanor sat still, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, felt a subtle motion in her foot. It wasn't enough to rise, but enough to crack the wall of pride she had built around herself. In the eyes of hundreds, she no longer saw pure contempt, but confusion, disbelief, and something resembling the early spark of belief. Malik glanced around, noticing every gaze locked on Eleanor, and softly said, "A small step is enough to change the whole world." In that moment, the laughter of previous days vanished. In its place came shock. A poor child, blood still crusting at the corner of his mouth, had awakened the first flicker of life in a paralyzed millionaire's legs, and that alone sliced through mockery like a knife, opening a new path where belief began to seep in, breaking apart the weight of oppressive power. Eleanor sat straighter, eyes fixed on Malik, and for the first time, something different shimmered in them, not disdain, but a flicker of hesitation mixed with fragile hope. Malik stood before her, so close to the red wheelchair that he could hear her quickened breathing. Every eye at the party was trained on those two figures, a skinny boy in worn clothes, and a powerful woman trapped by lifeless legs. In the thick silence, Malik leaned in, his voice low but cutting through every whisper like a blade. "Let your heart lead, and your legs will follow." His words were not only for Eleanor, but for the pride frozen deep within her. The entire room went still. Even the clink of silverware ceased. Guests frozen mid-gesture, wide-eyed, watching an outcome no one could predict. Eleanor heard every word, and in that moment, all the mockery from past days, every look of disdain, began to fade, making room for that gentle echo. Her heart, once hard as steel after years of battling helplessness, suddenly wavered. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, her trembling hand resting on the arm of the wheelchair, as if gathering every ounce of courage for an act that seemed meaningless. In her ears, the mocking laughter from previous parties dissolved, leaving only Malik's youthful voice replaying in her mind, urging her to step across the line between despair and hope. Then, the unimaginable happened. Eleanor's toe, lifeless for years, moved slightly. The motion was so small it seemed like an illusion, but it was clear enough that the crystal lights caught it and made it visible to hundreds of eyes. The entire hall froze. No more laughter, no more whispers, not a single glass clinked. Everything turned to stone. Eyes widened in disbelief. A few guests jumped to their feet, mouths agape, unable to speak. Malik slowly stood upright, his face still stained with old blood, but a faint smile appeared, his eyes blazing like fire. He knew this moment was the turning point, a small motion stronger than any speech. Eleanor opened her eyes, her blue pupils trembling, unable to believe what had just happened, yet the sensation in her foot was so real her heart raced. In that instant, she no longer heard Drake's jeering, no longer saw the sneering faces, and only realized she had just reclaimed a part of her life once stripped away. The air in the room seemed sucked dry. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid they might shatter the miracle that had just taken place. A wealthy man in the front row whispered shakily, "Did I imagine that?" A woman in a fur coat raised her hand to her mouth, eyes wide with tears. Even those who had laughed the loudest now sat frozen, faces pale, because they had just witnessed something far beyond the ridicule they had once dished out. Eleanor sat upright, her hand releasing the armrest. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her toe still trembled, as if to prove it wasn't an illusion. Malik stood beside her, calmer than anyone, and spoke softly. "You see, one small movement is enough to start it all over again." His words rang out like a bell, pulling the room out of its daze, but leaving behind a resonance not easily erased. In that opulent, powerful gathering, a barefoot child had silenced everyone with a single sentence, and a motion that once seemed meaningless. That moment didn't just change it shattered the wall of pride built by those who had mocked, and in that breathless silence, belief crept into the heart of a woman who once thought she had lost everything. The very next morning, headlines and online news feeds were flooded with sensational titles: "Paralyzed Millionaire's Toe Moves at Party Miracle" or "Hoax." A video recorded by a guest spread like wildfire, clearly showing Malik whispering into Eleanor's ear, followed by her toe twitching moments later. Public reaction exploded, some mocked it as a circus reaching its peak, others were skeptical, and many believed it marked a turning point in fate. Police jumped in immediately, holding a rushed press conference where the spokesperson coldly declared, "This is nothing but an illusion, a cheap setup meant to deceive the public. The millionaire has not recovered," and the video was doctored. The statement aired across all major channels, a desperate attempt to bury the truth, shaking the city. But the more they tried to cover it up, the more fiercely public discourse ignited. People debated in cafes, on subways, during meetings, from poor neighborhoods to luxury towers. Some believed it was a publicity stunt by Eleanor to regain attention, yet many began to recall Malik's words when he was forced to the ground. Money can't heal. The contrast between the boy's desperate origins and Eleanor's powerful status made the story more captivating than any movie. In the midst of the storm, Eleanor made a surprising public appearance, something she rarely did, unless tied to a major business event. The press conference was held right in the grand hall of her mansion, dozens of cameras aimed directly at the familiar red wheelchair. Standing beside her was Malik, thin and quiet, but his eyes shone bright. Reporters jostled. Mics thrust forward. Questions fired off in rapid succession. "Madam, did your leg really move? Was this all just a performance? What role did this boy play?" The air was thick with doubt, curiosity, and the hunger for a headline. Drake stood in the back, eyes ice cold, clearly expecting Eleanor to deny everything and shut down the circus he despised. But as camera flashes lit up the room, Eleanor unexpectedly reached out and stopped Malik from bowing his head. She sat up tall, her blue eyes gleaming with rare resolve, and spoke clearly. "I will not deny it. This boy stayed by my side last night, and he gave me something I had lost belief. You may call it an illusion. You may laugh, but I know what I felt was real. I believe in what I felt, and I believe in Malik." The entire hall erupted, reporters shouting over each other, cameras flashing non-stop. Drake frowned. His mocking smile vanished because he understood those words hit him like a direct slap to the face. Eleanor wasn't just refusing to hide the truth. She was publicly defending the boy in front of hundreds of lenses. Malik lifted his head, stunned, never having imagined that the powerful woman would speak up for him. His eyes lit up, as if he had found an ally he never expected. Her statements were immediately broadcast live on television. Viewers held their breath at every word, and when Eleanor ended with, "If you want to witness the truth, then wait, because this is only the beginning," social media exploded. Hashtags about her and Malik shot to the top of trending lists, and public opinion split into two clear sides. Whether they believed it or not, no one could dismiss the story anymore. And within Eleanor, for the first time, she no longer felt like the target of ridicule, but the one holding the power to redefine what people called truth. The public reaction after Eleanor's press conference quickly escalated into a fierce debate. On social media, thousands of posts appeared within hours, half claiming this was a small miracle, proving faith could spark the extraordinary, the other half insisting it was nothing more than a staged hoax for attention. Someone wrote, "I saw her toe move clearly. No way that was fake." But right below it, another snapped. "Don't be stupid. Any camera angle can create an illusion. Stop turning a joke into a myth." The media was equally divided, with some outlets praising Eleanor's courage for standing up for a poor child, while others mocked her for being swayed by a rookie street performer. Talk shows heated up, guests argued furiously, and one even stormed off the set, unable to tolerate opposing views. The already noisy city now felt split in two, one half desperate to believe in miracles, the other desperate to expose a bitter truth. In the poorer neighborhoods, Malik's story spread like wildfire. People talked about it in tea stalls, on sidewalks, and in dim alleyways where children's laughter mingled with admiration. Many mothers told their children the tale of a boy who dared to challenge power, who dared to believe in something adults had long abandoned. But in the wealthy districts, in glass tower offices, the story became a punchline. Some joked, "That kid should become a magician." Others scoffed at Eleanor as a weak woman being manipulated. This contrast existed not only in the media but also began to grow into a deeper social rift. One side saw a flicker of hope, the other a threat to the very order they benefited from. Amid the whirlwind of debate, Drake watched in silence, eyes sharp and cold. He knew the real danger wasn't whether Eleanor's toe had moved. It was the fact that a poor boy was being talked about by an entire city, slowly turning into a symbol beyond control. Drake sat in his office, cigar tips glowing one after another, smoke curling up to the ceiling, and in his mind was only one thought. This spark had to be extinguished before it became a blaze. He recalled his own warning from before that belief was more dangerous than any weapon, and now it was unfolding before his eyes. Drake summoned a group of trusted men, his deep voice echoing in the sealed room. "The public is divided, but the more divided they are, the more attention that kid gets. We can't let him continue to exist. Tonight, I want a clear plan. No traces left, no chances for anyone to suspect a thing." The henchmen exchanged glances, nodding, their eyes flickering with cruelty. One asked in a low voice, "Sir, what about Mrs. Voss? She's publicly defending the boy. If anything happens, the public will zero in on her." Drake smirked, his smile ice cold. "She'll think it was an accident. The whole city will think that. We are the law, never forget it." In the darkness, the plan to eliminate Malik was laid out in detail, like a death sentence, signed in silence. Drake leaned back in his chair, bloodshot eyes burning with rage. He didn't just want to get rid of a child, he wanted to crush the symbol that had begun to rise, to show everyone that belief led only only to ruin. Outside, the city buzzed with endless arguments, but in that sealed room, a dark conspiracy had taken form, waiting for the moment to strike. That night, as rain pattered steadily on the glass roof of the mansion, Eleanor sat alone in the study, gripping her wine glass but unable to take a sip. Her face was tense, eyes fixed on the pitch-dark space ahead as if searching for something invisible. Everything that had just unfolded, from the shocking party to the fierce arguments outside, had forced open a door of memory she had once tried with all her might to keep shut. She closed her eyes, and old images flooded in, as vivid as a film replaying in her mind. It was that fateful afternoon years ago, when the only man she had ever loved collapsed under police batons. Eleanor saw herself back on that narrow street, back when her legs still carried her with strength. The man she loved stood in front of her, arms spread wide to shield a wrongly accused neighbor. In the chaos of shouting police, batons came crashing down. Eleanor had screamed, lunged to stop them, but was shoved back, falling hard onto the cold pavement. She still remembered his eyes in those final moments, defiant, yet helpless, just before he fell into a pool of blood. The verdict had been brief: resisting law enforcement, killed on the spot. No one cared about the truth. No one spoke up for him, and all she had left was a hollow emptiness that gnawed at her for years. After that day, her world changed color. From a woman who once believed in justice, she became someone who trusted only in money and power. Eleanor built a wall of coldness around herself, turning her grief into armor, determined never to let anyone touch that buried wound. But tonight, seeing Malik collapse under police blows, blood spreading across the stone floor, and the defiant look in his eyes, it all echoed the last look in her husband's eyes. The two images blended, and the wall she had built over the years began to crack. She placed a hand over her chest, heart aching with a pain both familiar and foreign. In Malik's eyes, she saw the shadow of the man she lost, a spirit that refused to bow. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt that pain resurface, no longer buried. It took her breath away, made her hands tremble, but it also lit a fire she thought had long been extinguished. She whispered to herself, voice choking, "I lost him, but I won't let that boy share his fate." Outside, the world still mocked, Drake still schemed, but in that quiet room, Eleanor had made a silent decision. Malik wasn't just a stubborn he was a mirror reflecting her past. The bruises on his body brought back the invisible wounds inside her, and that connection was too powerful to ignore. She knew that protecting Malik meant standing against the entire system, stepping straight into a storm of criticism. But the pain of losing her husband, which once made her indifferent to everything, now gave her the strength to bear it all again, so long as the tragedy wasn't repeated. Eleanor lifted her head, eyes glowing in the dark, the light of a will newly awakened. She had once believed her life ended the day she lost the ability to walk, but somehow Malik had reopened an old wound and turned it into a force. The pain was no longer a shackle, but a key that unlocked another path, one she had never imagined. Now, Eleanor no longer felt alone in her loss, because there was a small boy carrying that weight with her, through his own blood and pride. And it was that very thing that made her realize this battle no longer belonged to Malik alone, it had become hers too. Eleanor sat still before the open window, rain falling steadily on the glass pane, wind slipping through the gap and sending the curtains fluttering. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if trying to break through the layer of ice that had sealed it for years. Memories of her husband's death tangled with the image of Malik being beaten at the mansion gate, forming a swirl of haunting pain that shattered her usual composure. All this time, she had lived like an observer, holding power but staying silent in the face of injustice, telling herself that silence was a way to survive. But tonight, the weight of it had crossed a threshold, and she knew clearly if she stayed silent once more, she would lose what little humanity she had left. She set the wine glass down, eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. Her voice, raspy but firm, rang out as if sentencing herself. "I won't let them repeat it." There was no one there to hear it, but the words lightened her chest, like a burden she had carried for years had just been lifted. She said it again, this time louder, to etch it into her mind that she had chosen a path she couldn't walk back from. The quiet room suddenly felt different, as if the four walls themselves recognized the shift inside her. Eleanor leaned forward, eyes on her unmoving legs. She no longer saw them as a sentence, but as a reminder that silence only makes evil stronger. It was her own helplessness that had kept her bowed all these years, but Malik's presence had shattered that ice. In the boy's stubborn eyes, she saw the same fire that once burned in her husband, a fire that dared to resist violence even knowing the cost could be death. Eleanor shivered, then gave a slight nod, as if speaking to memory itself, promising she would continue what he had left unfinished. From that decision, a seed of defiance sprouted in Eleanor's heart, so strong and unexpected that even she found it strange. She had been known for her coldness, for scorning everyone, yet now, instead of rejecting Malik, she wanted to protect him. That defiance wasn't only aimed outward but also inward, forcing her to confront the icy shell she had long believed was her armor. She realized she had hidden behind pride for far too long, using it to mask her fear, and that very pride had made her a bystander watching, never acting. This time, she would be different. Late that night, Eleanor sat writing a letter to her personal lawyer, requesting files on past cases of police abuse that had been covered up. Her steady fingers typed each word, her gaze sharp as a blade. With every line, it was as if a piece of her fear was drawn out, replaced by growing resolve. She recalled Malik's words in that dark room, "I don't have medicine, only faith." Now, she understood faith wasn't only for walking, it was for the battle she was about to enter. By dawn, Eleanor was still at her desk, eyes gleaming under the dim yellow light. She had long been used to giving orders, to being obeyed, but she had never faced the feeling of standing against those who once protected her under the guise of power. Now that she had chosen Malik's side, she knew this meant placing herself directly against Drake and the system behind him. The fear remained, but with it came a sense of release. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt true to her past, true to the pain she had buried. As morning light spilled into the room, Eleanor smiled. It was no longer a proud smile, but one of rare peace. In her heart, the seed of defiance had taken root, spreading through her veins, reshaping her into someone new. From now on, she was no longer just the wealthy woman in a wheelchair, no longer just a symbol of cold authority, but someone driven by the desire to fight the darkness that had stolen her husband, crushed Malik, and forced society to kneel. Eleanor placed a hand over her chest, silently reminding herself that the road ahead would be full of blood and tears, but at least she had chosen to walk it, even if only through the smallest of movements. And most importantly, she knew she was no longer alone, for now her heart beat in sync with a barefoot boy who had unintentionally reignited her will to resist. She saw clearly that Malik's faith had passed into her, burning into fierce determination. In that moment, Eleanor Voss no longer saw Malik as a spectacle, but as a destined ally, someone who would help her shake the very walls of power that once seemed unbreakable. That night, the slums were cloaked in a thin mist, streetlights casting a rust-colored glow on the crumbling rooftops. Malik had just returned to his tiny room when the flimsy wooden door burst open, and 3 police officers stormed in, steel batons glinting in their hands. Without a word, they bound the boy's wrists and dragged him outside. Malik resisted, shouting that he had done nothing, but his cries were silenced by a brutal punch to the stomach. One of them held out a warrant, reading in a gravelly voice like a pre-written sentence, "Arrested for theft of property from the city hotel." Malik froze, eyes wide with panic, but no one listened to his protests. Cold shackles clamped down on his small wrists, while neighbors peeked through their doors and quickly shut them again, afraid of police retaliation. The transport van tore through the night, its wheels grinding the pavement like blades shredding hope. Malik slumped inside, blood still seeping from his mouth, eyes filled with sorrow but not despair. He knew Drake had moved, and this was the trap set to end his journey. In the darkness of the vehicle, he whispered to himself, "I promise to prove it, and I won't let them end everything here." News of Malik's arrest reached the White Mansion within hours. Eleanor heard it from a loyal servant, her face turning pale, pounding wildly. She sat frozen in the drawing room, hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. Memories of her husband's unjust death rushed back, merging with the image of Malik being dragged away like disposable trash. She knew this tactic well, it was the same wound that had scarred her life. Eleanor suddenly turned her wheelchair, eyes burning like steel. "Get the car ready, we're going to headquarters." The servants were stunned. They had never seen her this fierce. The police headquarters stood in the city center, a massive gray stone building, neon blue lights flickering on its sign. By the time Eleanor arrived, dozens of reporters had gathered, the news of Malik's arrest spreading like wildfire. Cameras swiveled toward her, flashes flaring, questions flying. "Ma'am, do you know the boy just arrested? Were you sheltering him? Do you admit you've been manipulated?" Eleanor swept past them, eyes cold, answering no one. She moved straight inside, the wheels of her chair grinding sharply against the stone floor, a declaration in itself. Drake stood waiting in the main hall, his eyes cold, the corner of his mouth curled into a smile, part mockery, part challenge. He stepped closer, his voice slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Voss, I didn't expect you to care so much about a petty thief." Eleanor stopped her wheelchair, lifted her head, eyes steady and unflinching. "I'm here to demand the boy's immediate release. You've framed him, and I won't let this happen again." Drake burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the empty lobby, prompting nearby guards to lower their heads and chuckle. He leaned in close, whispering with an icy tone, "You're going against the law, and that law belongs to me." The air inside the station was thick, reporters crowding outside the glass walls, lenses aimed at every movement. Eleanor sat tall, hands resting on her chair's armrests, her voice clear and unwavering. The law is meant to protect people, not shield brutality. That boy didn't steal anything, and I will prove it. I'll make everyone see that you're covering up the truth. Her words sent a jolt through the room, and some of the guards nearby shifted uneasily, having never seen a woman in a wheelchair speak so directly to the chief of police. Drake clenched his fist, a flash of anger in his eyes, though he kept his voice laced with scorn. What do you think you can do? A beggar boy? And a crippled woman, taking on the whole system? Eleanor didn't look away, her voice striking like a hammer. I lost my husband to your cruelty. I won't let another child be crushed. If it's a war you want, fight it to the end. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the quiet clicks of cameras firing from outside. In that moment, Eleanor knew she had placed herself at the center of the storm, but her eyes burned with resolve. Malik was locked somewhere in the building, but she believed she would bring him back into the light. This time, she wasn't only fighting for Malik, she was fighting for the pain she had buried for years. And Drake, still standing there in his cloak of authority, realized that Eleanor Voss was no longer the helpless, prideful woman he once thought. She was now a fire ready to consume everything he had deemed untouchable. Every harsh line on his face was thrown into sharp relief, but in his eyes was a power steeped in menace. He leaned down to meet her gaze, his voice low and firm, echoing through the narrow lobby of the precinct. Your money can buy everything except my justice. The guards nearby smirked. A few reporters in the hallway stretched forward to catch every word, and Drake's line seemed designed to send a message to the entire city, that justice here didn't belong to the law, it belonged to him. Eleanor sat motionless, her hands trembling on the arms of her wheelchair, eyes locked onto the wrinkled, arrogant face before her, and her heart clenched. She knew Drake meant to break her spirit, to defeat her before the battle had even begun, but in that instant, a surge of heat rose in her chest, as if someone had reignited a flame she had hidden for years. The tension rose like steam, every eye now fixed on Eleanor. Behind her, a few officers whispered, their smug grins, hinting that they expected her to bow her head, to fall silent like so many before her who'd been crushed by Drake's power. But Eleanor was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows. She had seen Malik's blood, had remembered the look in her husband's eyes before he fell, and now, fear turned into fury. She drew in a long breath, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly they turned white, then suddenly raised her head, her sharp blue eyes flashing like steel. Her voice rang out, fierce and resonant, filled with pain and defiance. Justice does not belong to you. And the cry tore through the suffocating air, startling those nearest. It wasn't a simple protest, it was a roar from the depths of her soul, laced with both grief and the eruption of a spirit long suppressed. Drake froze, the sneer on his face going stiff, his eyes darkening for a split second. He hadn't expected Eleanor, the woman he'd always seen as a wheelchair-bound puppet, to challenge him so openly, right in the heart of his domain. Outside, camera flashes burst repeatedly, capturing every frame. And in that moment, Eleanor was no longer the arrogant millionaire. She was a woman standing for justice with everything left in her heart. The precinct lobby fell into a thick silence, broken only after a few seconds by murmurs rippling through the room. Some of the guards averted their eyes from Eleanor, sensing something in her words that shook even them. Though Malik was locked in a holding cell in the back and couldn't hear a thing, it was as if some invisible thread told him that someone out there was fighting for him. Eleanor stared directly at Drake, her face flushed. Her voice had startled even herself, but it gave her a strength she had never felt before. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the weaker one, but someone holding the truth in her hands, a weapon Drake could never possess. Drake snorted, trying to recover his calm, but his arrogance had cracked. He gave a harsh chuckle, stepped back half a pace, and lowered his voice with quiet menace. You'll regret saying that. But the threat didn't shake Eleanor. She gripped the armrests tightly, sat up tall, letting the overhead lights fall fully on her face. Her eyes no longer wavered, they burned like twin flames. And in that moment, everyone in the room, everyone watching from the crowd, understood that this was no longer just about a boy falsely accused. It had become a confrontation between a rotten system of power and a heart that had once been proud, but was now awakened. Eleanor's outcry at the precinct rippled through the city like a shockwave, inadvertently becoming the catalyst for silent hands that had long stayed hidden to finally take action. Just days later, a group of independent journalists released a bombshell set of documents, audio recordings, photographs, and anonymous testimonies exposing years of police abuse. The detailed reports described countless cases of wrongful arrests, torture, coerced confessions, and shady money transfers between high-ranking officers. Images of victims with battered bodies appeared on front pages, accompanied by brief but chilling captions that ignited public outrage. A city once divided now boiled with suspicion, as what was once called law revealed its dark underbelly. News broadcasts repeatedly mentioned Drake's name alongside a list of his associates. Several leaked videos showed guards assaulting civilians while laughing, becoming the epicenter of public fury. For the first time, the image of the police, once a symbol of order, was stripped of its polished facade and exposed as predators. At press conferences, department spokespeople tried to deny everything, but the evidence poured in like relentless waves, each day more damning than the last, turning every denial into farce. People began pouring into the streets, holding signs, shouting for justice on behalf of those whose suffering had long been buried in silence. Amid the storm, Eleanor Voss unexpectedly reappeared before the cameras, no longer retreating into silence as she once did. She sat tall in her crimson wheelchair, camera flashes flickering across a face no longer icy. Eleanor invited reporters into her estate, publicly releasing the full video of Malik being beaten outside the gates and her own eyewitness account. Her voice was steady and firm. "This is not an illusion, nor is it staged. I saw the truth, and I know many others have lived through the same. They were silenced, suppressed, but today I will speak for them. Those in power have no right to turn justice into a weapon against the weak." Her statement echoed across major media outlets, broadcast live on social platforms, and quickly became a trending topic. Her words no longer carried arrogance, but a blunt honesty born from a real wound. In Eleanor's eyes, people saw not just power, but empathy, awakening. She used her name, once painted with the gloss of wealth, to strike directly at the wall Drake had built. As these images spread, public outrage intensified, and the crowd protesting in the city square multiplied. They carried pictures of Malik and his now famous words, "I don't have medicine, only faith." That line appeared on signs everywhere, from poor markets to skyscrapers, becoming the slogan of a spontaneous movement. Eleanor understood she had opened a door that could no longer be closed, and for the first time in years, she realized silence was no longer an option. While Drake and his allies scrambled to contain the damage, every new piece of evidence struck like a blade into his already rotting reputation. His mask of authority began to fall, revealing the face of a man who had manipulated justice. Eleanor watched the events unfold on live television, her eyes glinting, knowing the path she had chosen was the right one. Malik, though still imprisoned, would hear the echoes of this uproar and understand that this battle had moved beyond the fate of one boy. It had become the fight of an entire society reclaiming the justice long stolen from them. Malik's image quickly filled every corner of the city, from rough sketches on crumbling walls to giant screens in the central plaza. His quote about faith was printed on t-shirts, pasted on flyers, even splashed across front pages of newspapers. In the boy's radiant eyes, people found something they had long lost the courage to face power head-on. Malik, once an anonymous child from the slums, became a symbol of resistance against injustice, his face a torch, leading those who had been trampled yet never dared to speak. The protests grew by the day, chants echoed through the streets. "Faith is justice. We will not be silent." Police were deployed to break them up, but the more they suppressed, the further the resistance spread, and Malik's name was spoken with growing reverence. In the small homes of the slums, people began telling children the story of the boy who dared to challenge the police, who held his head high against mockery. Malik became a symbol of belief in change, not because he had power, but because he proved that even the weakest could shake what once seemed untouchable. Many who had stayed silent after loved ones were wrongly killed now joined public gatherings, raising Malik's image in demand for truth. Shaky red letters began appearing on walls. "The boy made us believe again." All of it pierced Drake's pride like a dagger. In his cold office, the walls lined with medals now seemed to carry no meaning. He slammed his fist on the desk, voice thundering like a storm. "We'll crush them both." His eyes blazed red, breath heavy, veins bulging on his forehead as Malik's image flooded every channel. To Drake, a poor boy becoming a symbol was the ultimate insult, and Eleanor's public defense of him only added fuel to the fire. He summoned his trusted men, eyes sparking, voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Not just the kid, but Voss too. I want the public to see that going against us leads straight to ruin." The men nodded silently, their cold stares mirroring the will of their leader. Drake knew his grip on power was slipping, and the only way to hold it was to spread fear even greater than the hope Malik had stirred. Outside, the city echoed with chants for justice, but inside the thick walls of the police headquarters, a dark plot was unfolding. Malik's footsteps had cracked the mask of authority, and Eleanor's outcry had split that crack wider. Drake understood that if he didn't strike soon, he would be the one devoured. And from the moment he gave that order, the battle was no longer hidden. It had become an open declaration. Either faith would be crushed, or his rotten power would collapse. After days of public turmoil, while the city still pulsed with noisy debates and crowds waving banners, inside the White Mansion, Eleanor Voss quietly began a different journey. She sat in the large practice room, light filtering through the tall windows, highlighting every line on a face that no longer held its unshakable coldness. Malik stood across from her, his face thin but his eyes bright, both hands gently raised as if ready to guide. His voice came steady, slow, but with a force that stilled the room. Start with one small step. Believe you can. I'll be here. Those words made it impossible for Eleanor to turn away. She gripped the chair, breath quick, and slowly tried to lift her foot. Her body trembled. Sweat gathered on her brow. Every movement, once so simple, now felt like dragging a mountain. Malik stayed close, eyes fixed, gently repeating, "Let your heart lead. Your legs will follow." Eleanor shut her eyes, listening to the pounding in her chest, and then, unexpectedly, her foot shifted, just slightly, but enough to leave her stunned. Her hands clutched the chair, tears spilling without warning. Malik smiled, bowed his head, and whispered, "That's the first step. You don't need more, just belief." In that moment, Eleanor no longer felt trapped in darkness. She was stepping into something new, where strength didn't come from wealth, but from patience, and the belief passed on by a small, stubborn child. Word of Eleanor beginning to walk leaked out and quickly became fuel for the hateful. A group of officers blocked Malik's way as he left the mansion, eyes locked on him, one sneering, "A street brat teaching a millionaire to walk now, that's the joke of the century." Their laughter burst out, harsh, echoing through the alley. Malik stood still, didn't flinch, his eyes holding firm, a strange pride rising inside. He didn't respond, only clenched his fists, telling himself that every step Eleanor took would be living proof. Their jeers didn't break him, they only hardened his resolve. Eleanor heard the mockery repeated on news channels, and she felt the sting of how this society laughed at both her and Malik. But this time, instead of staying silent, she sat in the living room and called in a group of reporters. She said clearly, "Yes, a boy is teaching me to walk, and I'm proud of it. You can laugh, but every step I take is proof against all your laughter." Her words spread quickly, making even the loudest critics pause. Under the flash of cameras, Eleanor no longer looked like an untouchable millionaire, but like a human being brave enough to face her weakness and turn it into strength. Inside the practice room, the training sessions continued. Malik patient by the second, Eleanor proud but no longer hiding the pain. They both sweated, both fell, then both stood up again. Outside, the mockery still echoed, but within those four walls, every small movement became a victory. Eleanor realized that it was Malik's presence that made her dare to attempt what she once believed was pointless. And Malik, watching those trembling steps, believed more than ever that faith could achieve what power never could. When a short video clip of Eleanor wobbling to her feet for a few seconds went viral, public opinion erupted. Many who had stayed silent began to lean toward belief, while the mockers lost part of their argument. In Malik's unwavering gaze, and in Eleanor's shaky but undeniable steps, people saw a story that rose above all prejudice. And even as Drake tightened his grip behind the scenes, snarling in the shadows, he knew that every step Eleanor took was a cut into the wall of power he had built, and that the boy had sparked a fire that would not be easily extinguished. City news crews quickly arrived at the mansion after hearing Eleanor Voss had managed to take a few steps on her own. Camera lenses zoomed in, lights blazed, turning the once quiet practice room into a crowded, suffocating space. Malik stood beside her, sweat beading his face, his hand still steady under Eleanor's elbow. The cameras captured the moment those legs, once believed forever motionless, trembled as they lifted off the ground. Her body tilted forward but did not fall, and she slowly brought her foot down. The entire room held its breath. A few reporters gasped aloud, and that moment was broadcast live to millions of screens across the city. People watched from cafes, from small apartments, from slums to towering high-rises. Eyes were glued to the screen, as if witnessing the impossible. Some mothers clutched their children tighter, tears falling as they watched someone once helpless against fate now stand, guided by a child's determination. Many men quietly wiped away their earlier laughter, eyes shining as they replayed Malik's words, "Let your heart lead." The city seemed to pause for a few minutes, all its usual noise fading, replaced by the surge of emotion from that single moment. On the streets, the crowds protesting fell silent. As the giant screen in the square broadcast Eleanor's strained steps live, the chants ceased, replaced by a reverent stillness. When her first foot came down on the floor, the square erupted not in laughter, but in thunderous cheers. Some raised pictures of Malik, others held signs that read, "Faith is justice." It was no longer a slogan from a fringe group, but the voice of thousands rising as one. Inside the mansion, Eleanor kept walking, each heavy step dragging along memories and past pain. The cameras captured her collapsing onto the chair after a short walk, hair disheveled, face pale from exhaustion. But there was no despair in her eyes. She panted, hand trembling as it covered her face, then tears welled up and spilled over. In front of the cameras, Eleanor cried, but no one saw weakness. She cried like someone who had just recovered something once thought lost forever. These were tears of hope, of rebirth, after years buried in darkness. Malik quietly placed his hand on her shoulder, his eyes bright, as if to say their efforts weren't ending here. Eleanor looked up, glanced around the room still filled with cameras, then stared straight into one of the lenses. She didn't wipe away the tears still wet on her cheeks. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "I'm not crying because I'm weak. I'm crying because finally, I believe I'll go farther tomorrow." The words were broadcast live, and people everywhere heard them. Their hearts stirred. Eleanor's words were no longer those of a proud millionaire, but of someone who had fallen and dared to rise again, carrying light for thousands still crushed under the weight of darkness. One of the reporters closest to the camera teared up, and a few others couldn't hold back their emotions. On social media, the video of Eleanor crying spread at lightning speed. Millions of comments flooded in. Some wrote, "This is the first time I believe miracles exist," and others said, "If she can still have hope, then so can we." The wave of empathy was overwhelming, breaking down the walls of bias that had shadowed the story until now. Meanwhile, Drake sat in his office, watching the broadcast live, his face darkened with rage. Eleanor's tears on national television felt like a blade cutting into the authority he had built through fear. He knew that once people cried with Eleanor, they would no longer fear batons or prison bars. His fists clenched, his words hissed through his teeth, but the more furious he became, the more powerless he felt in the face of a rising tide of belief sweeping across the city. Eleanor sat quietly after the session, still catching her breath, but inside her surged a feeling she had never known. The tears didn't bring shame, they brought relief, as if the burden of years had finally been lifted. Malik stood beside her, his face glowing, and in both their eyes was a silent understanding. A small step had shaken the entire city, and a single tear had become a flame of hope strong enough to light the path ahead, where justice was beginning to be redefined. The day of Malik's trial unfolded under a suffocating atmosphere, with the entire city watching the Central District Courthouse, where the barefoot boy now stood bound in an oversized prison uniform. Those who despised him cheered mockingly, while his supporters lined up at the gates, holding signs demanding justice. Malik stepped out of the prison van, his face gaunt but his eyes still bright. He knew he was facing a scripted verdict, the charge of theft of property, merely an excuse to bury his voice. Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick. The prosecutors calmly arranged their files, and officers filled the room, as if to emphasize that the law belonged to them. Malik sat on the cold wooden bench, his hands trembling slightly, but his face proud. He no longer felt alone, knowing thousands outside were waiting to witness what came next. When the judge struck the gavel, its sharp crack silenced the noise, the courtroom lights shining directly on the defendant's seat. Malik listened closely to the charges, each word heavy like a rope tightening around his neck. But in that moment, he raised his head, eyes locking with those who sought to silence him, his lips moving as if to affirm he would not bow. Silence blanketed the room, the tension so thick it made people hold their breath. Then, the courtroom doors swung open. White light from the hallway spilled in, and in that light, Eleanor Voss appeared. She leaned on crutches, each uneven step echoing through the wooden floor, drawing every gaze. Her face was pale from exertion, but her eyes burned fiercely like fire. In a simple dress, Eleanor was no longer the arrogant millionaire in a wheelchair, but a living witness, a person who had just reclaimed strength through belief. The room erupted into murmurs, cameras flashed wildly, and reporters scribbled frantically. Her entrance wasn't just a surprise, it was a direct blow to the system orchestrating the trial. Eleanor reached the front row, her eyes never leaving Malik, then slowly turned to face the judge. "I'm here to testify," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion but clear. "This boy is not a criminal. I saw with my own eyes the police beat him and falsely accused him. I will not let the truth be buried one more time." Her voice rang through the air, reaching every ear in the room. Outside, Malik's supporters wept and chanted her name, while the prosecutors fumbled, their hands trembling with papers. Drake sat at the end of the bench reserved for police, his face flushed purple, eyes burning with fury. He hadn't expected Eleanor to defy him so openly in court, under the blinding light of hundreds of cameras. But the truth had surfaced, and the moment Eleanor entered on crutches, the scales of justice, once tilted in his favor, began to shift. Malik sat silently, tears welling at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't look away. He knew this was proof of the promise he once made. Faith had not only moved Eleanor's legs but had also given her the courage to reclaim her heart. The courtroom was no longer just a place to sentence a poor boy, but a battlefield between two forces. One, a system clinging desperately to its version of justice. The other, a light rising from a child and a woman once pushed to the brink. Eleanor stood tall, her crutches firm beneath her, her voice rising again. Justice does not belong to the oppressors. Justice belongs to the truth. And the truth is, this boy is innocent. Her words struck like a hammer, igniting the entire room, marking a turning point that could not be undone. Eleanor paused at the center of the chamber, light from the chandeliers above casting down on her face, highlighting each tense but radiant feature. She leaned on her crutches, gasping for air, then turned fully toward Malik, her blue eyes shining with a resolve never seen before. In the thick air, she spoke, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word, echoing through the courtroom. This boy gave me my faith back. The words dropped like a bombshell in the trial, shattering the quiet that had been awaiting a predetermined verdict. All eyes locked on her, some reporters frozen mid-motion, forgetting to press record, while prosecutors sat still, their pens halted mid-sentence. That sound was more than gratitude, it was a declaration. For Eleanor, once the embodiment of power and detachment, now stood acknowledging a transformation sparked by a boy the world had ridiculed. Her words carried more weight than any piece of evidence, because they came from the very figure the public had watched closely these past days. Malik bowed his head, tears in his eyes, his hands clenched tightly in his lap to keep steady. He knew that sentence was proof of the sacrifice and steadfastness he had carried. These tears weren't from fear anymore, they were because he knew he had done what once seemed impossible. In that moment, the entire courtroom fell silent. The ceiling fan kept spinning, but no one noticed. The rustling of paper stopped, and even the sound of breathing grew cautious. The air was so heavy it felt like everyone's heart was weighed down. Outside, the crowd waited, their earlier chants now fading, all seemingly joining in a unified silence to listen. In that silence, justice long distorted and twisted by power began to tremble. No one dared laugh, no one uttered mockery, because they all sensed one undeniable truth. Eleanor's words could not be dismissed as a performance. The judge sat above, striking his gavel mechanically, though his hand trembled slightly. He looked at Eleanor, then at Malik, and in that instant, the line between right and wrong blurred. The justice he thought belonged to the system suddenly felt unstable, because what lay before him was no longer a simple theft case, but an indictment of an entire mechanism. Some members of the jury exchanged glances, their eyes showing traces of confusion, as if for the first time in years, they realized justice was not a line of text on paper, but a belief carried in the hearts of people. Drake sat at the back of the room, his face flushed, eyes burning. He gripped the armrest tightly, trying to maintain a calm expression, but the creases on his forehead deepened with every second. He knew Eleanor's words had just unraveled much of what he had worked so hard to conceal. Every glance from the press, every look from the public, felt like a blade cutting into the power he held. But no matter how furious he was, Drake could do nothing now, because the room was holding its breath, and any move he made would be seen as evidence of brutality. Malik sat quietly, eyes fixed on Eleanor, his heart stirring with both pride and pain. He no longer needed to prove anything. Her words were the greatest proof of all. Those who once mocked him were forced into silence, and those who had doubted him began to waver. Across the city, television screens replayed the moment again and again. People sat still in front of their TVs, no longer arguing, just absorbing the rare moment when truth was spoken without needing evidence. The moment Eleanor voiced her confession, she wasn't just defending Malik, she was declaring that his existence had changed her, and that was something no force could deny. Every word she spoke carved itself into the public's memory, turning into a heavy stone hurled at the wall of false justice. The courtroom remained steeped in heavy silence, but that silence was the loudest voice of all the voice that said the scales had tipped, that justice was being pulled from the hands of a tyrant and returned to the people. As public attention still buzzed after the explosive trial, a flood of questions turned toward the poor boy named Malik, the one who had changed the city's entire perception of justice. People were curious whether he had truly relied only on innocent belief, or if a hidden truth lay behind him. And then, the truth slowly began to surface, starting with scattered accounts from hospital staff who had seen him lingering around the physical therapy units for years. Malik had no money for formal education, but he spent most of his time sneaking into rehabilitation rooms, standing behind cracked op doors, or crouching in dark corners to listen to every word doctors said to their patients. Day after day, the boy sat still in the shadows, memorizing each stretch movement, every principle of motion, and the explanations of how the brain sends signals to muscles. Old scraps of paper, salvaged from trash bins, became his only notebooks, where he diligently sketched diagrams of joints, leg muscles, and copied down notes in messy handwriting. He had no lab, no formal tutor, but his bright eyes never missed a detail. Gradually, Malik came to understand that recovery was not about miracles happening in a moment, but about patient training, about tiny movements repeated daily. Each time a nurse caught him sneaking in, he was thrown out immediately, yet Malik always returned, persistent like a shadow. Some days, he was so hungry he could barely stand, but he still stayed, until he had memorized another motion. People called it the stubbornness of a street kid, but in truth, it was the burning hunger for knowledge. Something that had turned him from a poor child into someone holding valuable insight no one had expected. Because of those quiet years, when he placed his hands on Eleanor's legs, it wasn't just an instinctive act, but the result of a long process of observation and persistence. When this truth came to light, many finally understood that what they had called a miracle was far from simple. Malik had believed, but that belief wasn't empty. It was backed by knowledge and lived experience. He knew how to make Eleanor believe in the connection between mind and body. He understood how the smallest twitch in a muscle could become the starting point of an entire journey. What doctors had overlooked, Malik had patiently gathered, piecing together fragments into a coherent picture, and it was this very persistence that allowed him to achieve what everyone else thought impossible. In the media, articles began to shift their tone. Instead of mockery, they analyzed the strange process Malik had undergone. Some medical experts were astonished when reviewing his messy notes, which revealed a basic understanding of the recovery mechanism. An older doctor said in an interview, "What amazes me isn't the boy's faith, but how he kept secretly learning for years. Sometimes, a miracle is simply the patience others can't hold on to." Those words silenced many, making it harder for people to dismiss Malik as a joke. Eleanor, upon hearing the story, was overwhelmed with emotion. She recalled the moment Malik placed his hands on her legs, once thinking it was impulsive, but now understanding that touch carried both knowledge and pain accumulated over time. She saw in that boy the image of a teacher, not won by title, but through genuine experience. Malik had taught her that strength lies not in power or wealth, but in belief nurtured by tireless perseverance. From the moment this truth spread, people's perception of Malik changed entirely. He was no longer called the delusional kid, but instead, the boy of faith and knowledge. His story became proof that great things sometimes begin in the shadows, where a child quietly learns while waiting for a chance to ignite the light. And in that moment, the whole city realized that miracles don't fall from the sky, they are born from a blend of understanding, belief, and patience. Malik, with his calloused bare feet and bright eyes, had shown everyone that justice begins with this simple truth. Eleanor sat in the vast room, afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows onto the marble floor, reflecting off the crutch leaning against the wall. She sat quietly, staring at her legs, then recalled the journey just past each tear, each trembling step taken under the watchful eyes of hundreds. But amid all the noise, she began to recognize a truth she had never faced before. What needed healing wasn't just her immobile legs, but her hardened heart, where wounds from the past still lingered. The pain of losing her husband, the loneliness of becoming a public joke, the coldness she had worn like armor to hide her weakness, all had turned her into a proud phantom. Eleanor suddenly realized that Malik wasn't just helping her recover her body, but awakening emotions long buried, teaching her to believe in human kindness once more. That skinny boy, with his clear eyes and steady voice, had done what the most skilled doctors and the most expensive psychologists could not. Malik had never attended formal school, nor did he possess any titles, yet every gesture, every word of encouragement from him sank deeply into Eleanor's heart, like a miraculous remedy. He didn't come to her out of pity, nor for gain, but with innocent belief, the belief that someone who had fallen could rise again, that a heart gone cold could be warm once more. In Eleanor's eyes, the poor boy was becoming a strange kind of teacher, showing her lessons she had never learned in her entire life. That day, Eleanor stepped out into the back garden of the mansion with her crutch, where roses bloomed vibrantly in the wind. Malik walked beside her, his steps light but his eyes steady. She stopped, looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, her voice choked but sincere, "I thought I was helping you, but in truth, it's me who needed healing." Malik looked up, slightly surprised, then smiled, a bright smile like sunlight breaking through clouds. He didn't answer, just quietly extended his hand to help her take another step. That small gesture made Eleanor feel a weight lift from her chest, as if someone were gently brushing away the thick layers of dust that had long covered her heart. From that moment on, the way she saw Malik completely changed. He was no longer just a stubborn street boy stirring up public attention, but a young teacher, a guide in her own journey. Eleanor, who was used to giving orders and being obeyed, now learned to listen, to be patient, even to accept falling down in order to rise again. Malik taught her that true strength isn't about never falling, but about getting back up from what seems impossible, and that realization made Eleanor feel freer than she had ever felt before. In the eyes of the public, Eleanor was still a powerful millionaire, but in the training room or out in the windswept garden, she was a student, intently following Malik's simple instructions. The media began calling him the young teacher of a millionaire, a title that felt both innocent and deeply meaningful. The articles no longer focused solely on the miraculous story, but shifted to highlight the power of belief and emotional healing. People wrote that Eleanor hadn't just risen on her feet, she had risen with her heart, thanks to a child once deemed worthless. Eleanor changed more with each passing day. She smiled more often, no longer avoided memories of her husband, and no longer flinched at the sound of ridicule. She learned to face things, to turn pain into purpose, and it all began with Malik. In a contrast that once seemed irreconcilable, a powerful millionaire and a poor child, a remarkable bond had formed. She no longer felt alone, and in Malik's gaze, she saw the value of connection. That boy didn't just free her from a wheelchair, he freed her from the darkness she had locked herself in for years. When night fell, Eleanor would sit by the window, watching Malik doze off on a chair, holding a tattered notebook in his hands. Even in sleep, he clutched that book filled with scribbled notes, a testament to years of patience and learning. She whispered softly, as if speaking to herself, "Young teacher, thank you for teaching me how to live again." And in her heart, something had become certain: her life would no longer be measured by wealth, but by the steps of hope, planted by the hands and heart of a child. The story of Malik and Eleanor had gone beyond the bounds of a legal case, becoming the spark that ignited the fury of those long oppressed. Across poor neighborhoods, flyers with the image of the barefoot boy passed from hand to hand, while hastily painted red slogans covered walls, spelling out a clear message: faith is justice. People of color, those who had lived in fear, began to rise, gathering in small groups. They carried no weapons, only chants and resolute steps. Mothers took their children to the streets, fathers lined up outside courthouses. Young men wore shirts printed with Malik's words, all forming a wave no one could stop. Television broadcast, live images of the crowd stretching for miles, fabric flags fluttering in the wind, chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Malik, justice for us. The sound of marching feet blended into a pounding rhythm, shaking the entire city. On those sweat-drenched faces, there was no longer fear, but unwavering belief. Malik, once a nameless child, had become the symbol guiding thousands. Faced with such force, Drake seemed cornered. He sat in his office, his eyes blazing with fury. On his desk lay thick reports on the protests, the chants shaking the control he believed unshakable. In urgent meetings, subordinates reported that the police had lost their authority, and many barricades had been broken by united citizens. Drake roared, slamming his fist on the table, "We can't let a child and a crowd of poor people take over the city. Crush them, at all costs." The order to suppress came in a storm of anger. Armored vehicles rolled out, red and blue lights flashing, and rows of armed officers marched toward the squares where citizens gathered. Loudspeakers blared warnings, cold voices ordered dispersal, but thousands did not retreat. They held hands, forming a human wall. An elderly woman with silver hair, hands trembling but eyes firm, shouted, "We won't leave. This is our city." Her voice was met with applause and thunderous chants that drowned out the loudspeakers. Cameras captured everything, broadcasting it live. People at home watched their TVs, seeing those once called powerless stand firm against heavily armed police, and their hearts trembled. Each step forward by the enforcers only fueled the public's outrage. Drake believed fear would dissolve the crowd, but the more he threatened, the stronger they stood. The crowd shouted Malik's name like a vow, turning the boy into the soul of a rebellion. Digital newsrooms simultaneously ran the headline, "Eleanor Voss, we will not be silent anymore." Social media exploded, with millions of shares turning that phrase into a national slogan. Not just in the city, but in nearby regions, people also took to the streets, holding candles, holding banners, continuing the fire that had just been ignited. In the dark alleys of slums, children wrote the slogan in white chalk on the walls, treating it like a new oath. In wealthy neighborhoods, those who once looked away now stood in silence, unable to dismiss the powerful spread of the movement as a joke. Inside the mansion, Eleanor sat in the living room, crutches by her side, her back straight, eyes sharp as steel. In front of the press cameras, she repeated once more, "This is no longer just about one boy. It's about all of us. Generations have stayed silent too long, letting justice be twisted. Today, I speak for those who no longer have the chance to speak. We will not be silent anymore." Her words poured fuel on the fire already spreading, turning it from a wave into a storm. Malik sat in the corner of the room, listening, eyes shining, understanding that what began as a small promise had now become a movement of thousands. Outside, across every street, the fire of resistance burned fiercely. People held candles in their hands, forming an endless sea of light. They marched through streets once stained with injustice, shouting the new slogan, and the glow reflected on their faces, washing away every trace of shame. Those who once mocked now dared not speak, as the momentum had grown too strong. From cafes to train stations to flea markets, every place echoed the same call, a chorus unlike anything the city had ever heard. Drake looked out from the window of police headquarters at the crowd below, his eyes bloodshot with rage. He roared, ordered a crackdown, but deep down, he knew his power had begun to crumble. The fire of rebellion, he thought, could be extinguished with violence, had now spread beyond control. This was no longer a battle of one boy, or of one wealthy woman, but of an entire community that had awakened. And as that night passed, with the city aglow in candlelight and echoed cries, everyone understood that history had shifted course, where silence was no longer an option, and justice no longer a commodity in the hands of the powerful. Before dawn could fully break, with the sky still stained in ashen gray, the sound of armored vehicles and sirens thundered through the streets, leading to the community center. Drake deployed his entire force, a long line of riot police in armor, shields, and steel batons surrounding the area from all sides, turning it into a suffocating fortress. Spotlights swept across the square, their cold white beams shining directly on the gathered crowd. The air grew thick, the sound of boots, pounding pavement, mixed with the clatter of metal, creating a heavy rhythm that signaled an inevitable confrontation. Within the iron barricade, Malik appeared, his small frame contrasted by his piercing eyes, clutching a crumpled banner that read, "Faith is justice." Behind him stood the people, young and old, poor laborers and mothers with children in arms, all linked together, forming a human wall. They carried no sticks, no weapons, only voices raised in unison. "Justice for us." Malik stepped forward a few paces, facing the police directly. Under the cold lights, his shadow stretched across the pavement, slender yet defiant like a small flag in a storm. Drake stood atop a command vehicle, his face etched with rage. He raised his hand, and loudspeakers blared the dispersal order. "If you do not leave, we will use force." The threat echoed through the square, but no one moved. Malik took a deep breath and spoke clearly, his voice unwavering. "We're not leaving. We've been silent too long. Today, we stand here to face the truth." His voice wasn't loud, but through the broadcast microphones, it carried through every corner of the city, into the screens of homes tuned into the live stream. The crowd behind Malik roared in response, the sound crashing like waves against the police line. The riot officers wavered slightly, not from physical pressure, but from the overwhelming strength of united spirit. A few young officers looked down, their eyes uncertain, knowing their parents might be somewhere in that crowd. Drake roared again, signaling for an advance, but at that moment, Malik stepped forward once more, his dark eyes locked on the riot shields. He didn't shout, he simply spoke with calm clarity. "You can knock down a child, but you can't knock down the faith of the thousands standing here." The entire square fell silent for a beat, then erupted with the unified cries of the people. The roar was so loud it drowned out the police sirens, overpowered the loudspeakers. Cameras swept across the scene, broadcasting the moment live for the world to see, as a barefoot boy led thousands standing face to face with a heavily armed force. Eleanor watched from afar, her heart pounding wildly, hands trembling on her crutches, tears streaming down her face. She knew the final battle had truly begun, where justice no longer lived in tall buildings or cold documents, but in every step taken by those brave enough to rise. Drake clenched his fists, his eyes bloodshot, but he also understood that if he gave the order to strike now, the entire city would rise, and his power would collapse faster. The flame had been lit, and Malik was the torch leading the way. This final showdown was not just a clash of batons and shields, but a battle between fear that had been fed for years, and faith that had just been awakened. And in that very moment, the world seemed to hold its breath to see who would fall first. In that tension, as tight as a breaking string, the sound of crutches tapping steadily on the pavement echoed across the square, turning every head. From behind the crowd, Eleanor Voss appeared, limping but proud. Her hair was tousled in the wind, the spotlights shining directly on her frail frame, but her blue eyes were blazing. She said nothing, only walked silently through the sea of people, parting to let her through. Each step held a past long imprisoned, now released with the strength of the present. When she reached the police barricade, she stopped, steadied her crutches, then stepped forward, placing herself directly in front of the black barrel aimed at Malik. That moment froze the entire square. The image of the once proud, once helpless millionaire, now standing as a human shield for a barefoot child, sliced through every prejudice. Cameras caught it in full and streamed it live, sending Eleanor's stance before the gun barrel onto screens everywhere, both local and international. She lifted her head, her voice raspy but clear. If you want to shoot, shoot me first. But remember, one bullet today will not silence the truth. Her words struck the hearts of those holding the guns, making their hands tremble, their eyes waver. Malik looked at Eleanor, tears welling up, understanding she had chosen a path with no return. The crowd behind them broke into sobs, then shouted louder than ever. "We will not be silent anymore." The chant spread outward, from the square to the streets, from the streets to the markets, echoing back like unstoppable waves. Reporters scrambled to capture the scene, and the television commentator choked up as he spoke. A historic moment has just taken place, as Eleanor Voss stands before a rifle to protect the truth. Drake screamed furiously from the command vehicle, ordering the formation to tighten, but he knew deep down his power was crumbling at the roots. Once that image had gone viral, he no longer controlled the narrative. In the eyes of millions, justice had changed hands, no longer held by the police, but standing with those once seen as powerless. A young officer in the riot line suddenly lowered his weapon, looked at Eleanor, then at Malik, and turned away from the formation. That act sparked a chain reaction, as dozens of others followed, dropping their weapons too. The truth exploded before everyone's eyes. No one believed the lies about order and safety Drake had painted anymore. International media jumped in. Major news networks broadcast urgent bulletins, exposing the true face of a system long decayed. The chants of resistance grew louder, stronger, forcing the government to call an emergency meeting. That same night, an official statement was released. All charges against Malik were dropped, the crackdown suspended, and an independent committee would be formed to investigate the police's abuse of power. The announcement aired live as citizens cheered, their eyes shining as if they were finally witnessing the dawn. Eleanor sat down on a stone bench in the square, sweat on her forehead, her hands trembling as they clutched her crutches. Malik ran to her and hugged her tightly, his face soaked but his smile bright. She whispered, "We did, because the truth can't be buried forever." Her words made the crowd weep. People embraced each other, shouting the names of Malik and Eleanor as symbols of rebirth. In the command room, Drake stood still, watching the screens show his officers abandoning their posts. He understood then that his empire had fallen in a single night. The mask of power had dropped, and for the first time in his life, he tasted defeat at the hands of those he had always looked down on. The entire city ignited with the flame of resistance, but it was no longer a fire of blind anger. It was the light of hope and justice being restored. The moment Eleanor stood before the gun barrel would forever be etched in history, a reminder that some truths cannot be hidden, and some steps, no matter how unsteady, are strong enough to lead an entire community into the light of dawn. On the day the city lit up after a long night of resistance, Eleanor Voss made her first public appearance at a press conference held in the square. She no longer sat in her familiar red wheelchair. Instead, with sturdy crutches, she walked slowly but proudly. Each step, though heavy, carried the weight of a journey filled with blood, tears, and the faith that helped her break free from her own helplessness. The crowd erupted in applause, many shedding tears at the sight of someone who once imprisoned herself in despair, now able to stand and walk in the light. Media outlets broadcast it live, and those images flooded screens across the city, turning Eleanor into a symbol of pride reclaimed after ruin. With a voice still slightly trembling, Eleanor firmly declared that the days of sitting in a cold mansion were over. She said she had seen that true strength did not lie in vast wealth or powerful status, but in faith and shared humanity. Because of that, she announced the launch of a foundation named Leftovers, inspired by a simple comment Malik once made. The name surprised many, but Eleanor smiled and explained, "What society once deemed as leftover, if given in the right way, can become seeds that save countless small lives." Her words silenced the square for a few seconds. Then applause roared like thunder, mixed with chants of her name and Malik's. The Leftovers Foundation quickly became the center of public attention. Eleanor invested her entire personal fortune into it, affirming that every dollar would no longer buy influence but rebuild justice and pave a path for poor children. She pledged that the fund would create community centers, provide food, shelter, and most importantly, educational opportunities for children like Malik who had once been abandoned. She wanted every child to have the right to live, to learn, and to believe in their ability to change their own fate. At the launch ceremony, Malik stood beside her, his face radiant, no longer just a witness, but now the soul of an entire movement. People saw clearly the bond between a once frozen millionaire and a once despised child. They called it proof that justice does not divide rich from poor, only those who dare to rise from those who choose silence. The image of Eleanor placing her hand on Malik's shoulder in the flash of hundreds of cameras became a widely shared photo, a symbol of a new chapter for the city. The tycoons, once distant or mocking, began to align themselves with Eleanor. Some boldly invested, others publicly expressed support, realizing that if they continued to resist this wave of justice, they would be the ones left behind. Leftovers thus became more than a charity fund. It marked a shift in power from those who only knew how to consume to those willing to share. Contributions poured in, pledges were signed, and the flame Malik had sparked was now sustained by Eleanor into a lasting movement. Eleanor moved among the people, no longer hiding her sweat or trembling steps. She understood that each movement was a reminder that miracles don't happen by chance, but are born from belief and persistence. The wealthy followed her not to glorify the old power, but to relearn how to be part of a community. The square roared with cheers as Malik raised Eleanor's hand, and together they declared, "We will build a city where no one is seen as left over." Thousands echoed the words, and the chant spread like an anthem of resistance turned into triumph. As night fell, the lights from the newly built Leftovers foundation building glowed brightly, beaming into the sky like a lighthouse. Eleanor sat by the window, watching Malik play with children in the yard, her heart swelling with a peace she had never known. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but at least she was walking it in the right direction. Each step might be slow, but it was proud, and from that, she came to understand that true wealth lies not in assets, but in the ability to give hope. In her heart, Malik would forever be the young teacher who taught her to walk again, not just with her legs, but with her soul. The day the city lit up with new faith was also the day the shadows cast by those who once held power were torn apart. Drake and his associates were brought before the court in a trial unlike any before. A flood of evidence from the press, witness testimonies, and publicly broadcast footage painted a raw portrait of a system of abuse, where justice had been traded for blood and tears. The entire society followed every detail, from the confessions of junior officers to Drake's dazed expression as the long indictment was read aloud. The courtroom gallery was packed, and outside its gates, crowds still held banners high bearing the words, "No more silence. Faith is justice." Eleanor sat in the witness stand, leaning on her crutches but proud, while Malik sat right beside her, eyes shining. They didn't need to say another word, because the truth had already erupted, laid bare before the entire society. When the verdict was read, naming each guilty figure in the network, the courtroom erupted in cheers, while Drake sat motionless, his face pale, as if all the power he had clung to had turned to ash. The people witnessed not only the fall of a tyrant but also their own awakening. They realized that justice never lies in the hands of a select few but in the hands of those who dare to stand up, even with just a small step. That moment swept through the city like a wind clearing away years of fog. Those who once lived in fear now looked at each other with trust. Those who used to bow their heads now walked tall, stepping into the streets with newfound pride. In poor neighborhoods, the laughter of children filled the air, and the community centers of the Leftovers Foundation began opening their doors, offering warm meals and chances to learn. Society had awakened, not because it gained another billionaire, but because a once scorned child had shown everyone where real strength lies. At the closing ceremony, Eleanor stepped onto the stage set up in the square, where thousands waited. Malik stood beside her, his face beaming. Eleanor braced on her crutches, took a deep breath, then spoke out in a voice that carried. Power doesn't lie in money, but in the faith and courage to follow even the smallest steps that truly lead the way. The crowd echoed her words, their voices booming through the streets, reaching every heart. Malik's small steps, his stubborn bravery, and Eleanor's painful but proud journey had become a beacon for an entire generation. The sunset cast its glow over the city, but the light within its people still burned bright. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they also knew that from now on, no one could take away their voice. Justice was no longer some distant idea, but the breath, the heartbeat of a community that had awakened. And it had all started with a child who dared to believe in something that once seemed impossible. Malik smiled. Eleanor gripped his hand, and together, they looked out over the crowd as witnesses to a moment history would never forget. Amid the square lit by brilliant lights, as the evening breeze passed through the lingering crowd, Eleanor and Malik stood side by side, quietly watching the city that had just survived the greatest upheaval in its history. From what began as a seemingly naive promise by a barefoot boy, events had erupted one after another, forcing an entire society to change. What moved people most was not just that Eleanor had learned to walk again, or that those in power were brought to justice, but that the journey had proven justice could be awakened from the most fragile of places. Malik, the child once mocked for daring to believe, had become the seed that planted in everyone a yearning to live truthfully and rise against injustice. The story ends with the image of Eleanor walking through the cheering crowd, proud though still slow, but in every step, there is a declaration of the power of courage. The days she spent confined to a wheelchair were not only about physical pain, but also a binding of the spirit, until one small boy touched that frozen heart and reignited the flame she thought had long gone out. The journey from contempt to compassion, from fear to bravery, turned Eleanor into proof that people can be reborn if they dare to face the truth and open their hearts. When society looked up to Malik, they didn't see a miracle, but a lesson in patience and knowledge. The days he snuck into therapy rooms, gathering fragments of knowledge and combining them with innocent belief, proved that success doesn't come in a flash, but is built over time. People were moved as they realized that what they once called a miracle was in fact born of understanding, perseverance, and unyielding courage. That boy had shown everyone that even with nothing in hand, a heart that doesn't give up can still shift the course of destiny. With the Leftovers Foundation, Eleanor had opened a new path where poor children would no longer have to beg for scraps like Malik once did. She wanted the world to see that even what society called leftovers could become the seeds of transformation. When the wealthy came, not to flaunt power but to learn how to share, that was the beginning of a society that valued human dignity over money. The foundation didn't just give out food, it gave out opportunity, so that every child could grow up believing they mattered. Drake and his allies were brought to trial not just for their specific crimes, but because they represented a system that had long decayed. The sentence handed down didn't just seal the fate of one dictator, it opened a new chapter, where the people understood that real power cannot be sustained by fear forever. When a woman once seen as helpless stood to defy, when a boy once dismissed dared to speak, that was when justice no longer belonged to a few, but returned to the people. The message that remains after everything is that strength doesn't lie in wealth, in medals, or hollow promises, but in the belief and bravery to follow small but steady steps. Malik walked with calloused bare feet, and each of his steps cleared a path for thousands to leave behind their silence. Eleanor walked with feet once thought immobile, and every uneven step she took shook an entire society. That strength didn't come from status, but from a heart that believes change is real. Those who watch this story may find many lessons for themselves. That truth sometimes comes from those we least expect, that a simple promise can become the origin of a revolution, that no one is born to be forever labeled as leftovers, and sometimes, even the smallest gesture is enough to save a soul. More importantly, the story reminds us that each of us, whether rich or poor, has a responsibility to protect justice, because justice is not a commodity to be traded, but the breath that keeps a community alive. As the night comes to a close, the city still glows with candles that symbolize a newfound belief. People pass on Eleanor's words. Strength lies not in money, but in belief and courage. And in that light, The image of Malik and Eleanor walking side by side becomes the symbol of an era just awakened. It is not merely the end of a story, but the beginning of a long journey where every person learns to rise, to believe, and to walk forward even when the road is full of storms. The story ends with the awakening of society, with chants echoing through every street that justice has found its place. But more deeply, it ends with the awakening of each heart, that miracles never come from waiting, but from courageous steps, however small and steady, that lead an entire community toward the light.